Hey there, history hunters. Tonight we're tackling something absolutely massive. The entire story of India, a land that's been cooking up civilization while most of the world was still figuring out fire. We're talking about the birthplace of yoga, zero, and some of the most mind-bending philosophy you've ever heard. This isn't just another history lesson. This is 5,000 years of empires rising and falling, religions being born, and enough plot twists to make your head spin. Before we jump in, smash that like button if you're ready for this marathon, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? I want to know if you're joining me from Mumbai, Montreal, or maybe even the middle of nowhere. Now kill those lights, get comfortable, and buckle up. We're about to speed run through millennia of one of the most fascinating civilizations on Earth. Let's go. So let's talk about India. And I mean really talk about it, because this place isn't just another dot on the map where some stuff happened once upon a time. We're dealing with a landmass that's been at the absolute centre of human civilization for longer than most countries have had written language. The Indian subcontinent sits there like a massive triangular wedge jutting down into the Indian Ocean, surrounded by water on three sides and sealed off up north by the Himalayas, which are basically nature's way of building the world's most impressive fence. These aren't your average mountains, by the way. We're talking about peaks so high that they literally scrape the edge of where Earth's atmosphere gives up, home to Mount Everest and its buddies, all standing there like ancient bouncers, making sure nobody just casually wanders in from Central Asia without really committing to the journey. This geographical setup is absolutely crucial to understanding why India became what it became. You've got this enormous shield of mountains creating a natural barrier that made the region simultaneously isolated enough to develop its own distinct cultures and accessible enough through specific mountain passes that ideas, people, and goods could still flow in and out. It's like living in a gated community, except the gate is made of rock, ice, and the very real possibility of altitude sickness. The Khyber Pass, the Bolan Pass, these narrow corridors through the mountains became the highways of the ancient world, the places where armies marched, traders hauled their goods, and entire populations migrated when they felt like a change of scenery, which, as we'll see, happened more than a few times. Now, the geography doesn't stop being interesting once you get past the mountains. Not even close. The Indian subcontinent is basically a greatest hits album of different terrain types all smashed together. You've got the Indo-Gangetic Plain, this massive stretch of incredibly fertile land watered by some of the world's most important rivers. The Indus River in the west, the Ganges flowing through the heart of the subcontinent, the Brahmaputra curving down from the northeast. These aren't just rivers, they're civilizational lifelines. They provided water for crops, transportation routes, fish for dinner, and in the case of the Ganges, a goddess that millions of people still worship today. Not bad for a body of water. Then it's drier than the northern plains, rockier, but still incredibly important for everything that happened in Indian history. The coastal regions along both the western and eastern shores became centres of maritime trade, connecting India to the rest of Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe and Africa. Ships have been sailing in and out of Indian ports for thousands of years, carrying spices, textiles, gems, and ideas in both directions. India wasn't just receiving cultural influences from outside, it was broadcasting its own culture across the ancient world like some kind of civilizational radio station. The climate adds another layer to this geographical complexity. You've got the monsoon system, these seasonal winds that bring absolutely torrential rains for part of the year and then disappear for the rest of it. Ancient Indian civilization had to figure out how to work with this boom and bust cycle of precipitation, and they got remarkably good at it. They built irrigation systems, storage facilities, entire cities designed around managing water flow. Because if you didn't manage water properly in this part of the world, you were either drowning in it half the year or desperately searching for it the other half. There was no middle ground. The monsoons were like that friend who either shows up 6 hours early to your party or doesn't show up at all, consistent in their inconsistency. But here's what makes India truly special as a cradle of civilization: the sheer duration of continuous human habitation and cultural development. We're not talking about a civilization that peaked once and then faded away. We're talking about a region that has been continuously inhabited, continuously developing culture, religion, philosophy, science, and art for thousands upon thousands of years. Empires rose and fell, invaders came and went, religions were born and spread, and through all of it, there's this thread of cultural continuity that stretches back into the mists of prehistory. It's like watching the world's longest-running TV show, except instead of jumping the shark after season 5, it just keeps finding new ways to stay relevant. The economic significance of India throughout history cannot be overstated. For most of recorded history, India was one of the wealthiest regions on the planet. It had fertile soil for agriculture, which meant surplus food production, which meant you could support large populations, which meant you could have people who didn't spend all day farming and could instead focus on things like inventing mathematics, writing philosophy, or creating art. The subcontinent was also blessed with natural resources, gems, minerals, timber, cotton. Indian cotton textiles were so prized in the ancient world that the Romans were literally draining their treasury buying them. Roman silver coins have been found all over southern India, evidence of a trade relationship so lucrative that Roman authors complained about how much money was flowing east to pay for Indian luxuries. Imagine being so good at making cloth that you're economically threatening the Roman Empire. That's the level we're operating at here. And culturally? India has been a laboratory for human ideas since before most civilizations existed. This is where some of humanity's oldest religious and philosophical traditions were born. Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, all indigenous to the subcontinent. The concepts that came out of India have shaped how billions of people understand reality, morality, consciousness, and the nature of existence itself. We're talking about ideas like karma, reincarnation, meditation, yoga, the concept of zero in mathematics, the decimal system, early astronomy that calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy. While other parts of the world were certainly developing their own sophisticated ideas, India was particularly prolific in producing frameworks for understanding the universe that spread far beyond its borders. The linguistic diversity alone tells you something about the deep complexity of Indian civilization. The Indo-Aryan languages descended from Sanskrit dominate the north, while the Dravidian languages hold sway in the south. And then you've got dozens of other language families scattered throughout, each representing distinct cultural traditions. Modern India recognizes 22 official languages, and that's not counting the hundreds of dialects and regional variations. It's like a massive family reunion where everyone is definitely related but also definitely has their own opinions about everything. So when we talk about India as a cradle of civilization, we're not just throwing around fancy words. We're talking about a place that has been fundamental to human development for as long as humans have been developing. It was a technological innovator, an economic powerhouse, a cultural and religious fountainhead, and a crossroads where East met West, North met South, and ideas collided and combined in ways that shaped the entire world. And all of this happened in a place that geography had simultaneously isolated and connected, protected and exposed, blessed with resources and challenged by climate. India didn't become a cradle of civilization despite its geography, it became one because of it. Now, having established just how important and special this place is, let's go back. Way back. Not back to the Mughals or the Mauryans or even the Vedic period. Let's go back to a time before empires, before cities, before agriculture, before anyone had figured out that planting seeds in dirt was a more reliable way to get food than just wandering around hoping to stumble across something edible. We're talking about prehistoric India, the deep time before written records, before temples and palaces, when the Indian subcontinent was populated by people whose entire way of life has left only the faintest traces in the archaeological record. Meet the Adivasi, which literally translates to original inhabitants, or indigenous people. These were the first humans to call the Indian subcontinent home, and when I say first, I mean potentially up to 30,000 years ago, maybe longer. We're in the realm of anatomically modern humans who are still figuring out the whole civilization thing, which at that point was less about building cities and more about not dying. These early inhabitants were hunter-gatherers, living a nomadic lifestyle that would seem impossibly harsh by modern standards, but was actually a pretty reasonable way to exist if you were a human in the Paleolithic period. You follow the game, you collect edible plants, you set up temporary camps near water sources, and when the resources in one area get depleted, you pack up and move on. No mortgages, no property taxes, but also no grocery stores, no medicine, and absolutely no customer service departments to complain to when things went wrong. The Adivasi weren't a single unified group, by the way. That would be far too simple. We're talking about numerous distinct tribal groups scattered across the subcontinent, each adapted to their specific environment. The people living in the forests of central India developed different survival strategies than those living along coastal regions or in the river valleys. Some groups specialized in hunting large game, others focused more on fishing or gathering. They developed intimate knowledge of their local ecosystems, which plants were edible, which were medicinal, which would kill you if you looked at them wrong. This knowledge was passed down through oral traditions, generation after generation, and while it might not seem as impressive as building the Taj Mahal, let me tell you, knowing which berries won't cause your internal organs to shut down is a pretty valuable skill set. The archaeological evidence for these early inhabitants is frustratingly sparse, which is what happens when you're dealing with people who lived tens of thousands of years ago and didn't leave behind stone temples or written records. What we do have are stone tools, lots and lots of stone tools. Hand axes, scrapers, blades, all carefully worked from stone using techniques that would have been passed down through generations. These tools tell us that prehistoric Indians were sophisticated craftspeople who understood the properties of different types of stone and knew how to shape them into useful implements. We found these tools scattered across the subcontinent in river valleys, rock shelters, and cave sites, marking the presence of human activity going back into the mists of time. Rock art is another crucial piece of evidence. In various locations across India, particularly in central India and in rock shelters throughout the Deccan, we find paintings and engravings created by these early inhabitants. These aren't just random doodles, they're sophisticated artistic expressions depicting animals, hunting scenes, dancing figures, and abstract symbols whose meaning is lost to us now. Some of these paintings have been dated to thousands of years ago, created with natural pigments that have somehow survived millennia of exposure to the elements. Looking at them, you get this eerie sense of connection with people who lived unimaginably different lives, but who clearly had the same human impulse to create art, to represent their world, to leave some mark of their existence for the future. Though they probably weren't thinking about future archaeologists when they were painting buffalo on cave walls, more likely they were engaged in some kind of ritual or ceremonial practice, or maybe just really liked buffalo. Hard to say. The lifestyle of these prehistoric peoples was governed entirely by the seasons and the availability of resources. During the wet season, when the monsoons arrived, the landscape would transform. Rivers would swell, vegetation would explode, and game animals would be abundant. This was the season of plenty, when food was relatively easy to come by, and you could afford to stay in one place for longer periods. But then the dry season would arrive, and suddenly everything would get more challenging. Water sources would shrink, vegetation would wither, and animals would either migrate or cluster around the remaining water holes. The hunter-gatherer groups would have to adapt, moving their camps, changing their diet, working harder to find sufficient food and water. It's not exactly the kind of lifestyle that lends itself to stability or comfort. You couldn't just call for takeout when you were tired of hunting. You either found food or you went hungry, and if you went hungry enough times, you stopped being a factor in the evolutionary equation. But here's the thing about humans. We're adaptable. Remarkably adaptable. These early Adivasi groups didn't just survive in the diverse and often challenging environments of the Indian subcontinent, they thrived. They spread across the entire landmass, from the Himalayan foothills to the southern tip of the peninsula, from the western coast to the eastern river valleys. Each group adapted to local conditions, developing specialized knowledge and techniques for their specific environment. The people living in the Western Ghats dealt with dense rainforests and developed intimate knowledge of forest resources. Those in the drier regions of what's now Rajasthan became experts at finding water in seemingly barren landscapes. Coastal groups became skilled fishermen and shellfish gatherers, reading the tides and seasons of the sea. It's this adaptability, this ability to look at a new environment and figure out how to extract a living from it, that allowed humans to colonize basically every habitable zone on the planet. Social organization in these prehistoric groups was probably relatively egalitarian compared to later civilizations. When you're a band of 30 or 40 people wandering around trying to find dinner, you don't have the population or the surplus resources to support elaborate hierarchies. Everyone had to contribute to the survival of the group. Sure, there were probably leaders, people whose judgment was trusted or who had special skills, but the rigid class structures that would characterize later Indian civilization simply couldn't exist in a nomadic hunter-gatherer context. You were all in it together, and if someone wasn't pulling their weight, well, that was a problem for the whole group. So should we head toward the river or toward the forest? I don't know, what do you think? I asked you first. And so on, possibly for hours. The spiritual life of these early peoples is one of the great mysteries we'll never fully solve. We can look at the rock art and make educated guesses about shamanic practices, animal spirits, and fertility rituals. We can note that many of the painted sites seem to have been used repeatedly over long periods, suggesting they held some special significance, possibly religious or ceremonial. But the actual beliefs, The myths they told around their campfires, the songs they sang, the names they gave their gods or spirits, all of that is lost. It's like trying to understand modern Christianity by looking at abstract paintings in a church basement. You might get some general ideas about symbolism and importance, but the specific content of the religion would remain frustratingly out of reach. What we can say is that these people were fully human in every sense, which means they were almost certainly asking the big questions. Why are we here? What happens when we die? Why do bad things happen? Is there something beyond the physical world we can see? The answers they came up with shaped their lives and their cultures, but those answers have vanished into the depths of prehistory. One particularly interesting aspect of this prehistoric period is the diversity of the population itself. The Indian subcontinent, by virtue of its position and geography, has been a destination for human migrations from multiple directions over tens of thousands of years. You had populations moving in from Africa through the Middle East, groups coming down from Central Asia, possible maritime migrations along the coasts. Over time, these different populations mixed and intermingled, creating the genetic diversity that characterizes the Indian population to this day. This wasn't some simple story of one group replacing another. It was a complex ongoing process of migration, mixing and adaptation that played out over millennia. The modern Indian population is the result of thousands of years of this mixing, carrying genetic markers from disparate populations that arrived at different times from different directions. It's like the world's longest-running potluck dinner, except instead of bringing casseroles, people brought genes. As we move forward in time, though still firmly in the prehistoric period, we start to see evidence of increasing sophistication in tool-making and resource use. The stone tools become more refined, more specialized. We see the development of microliths, tiny, carefully worked stone blades that could be hafted onto wooden or bone handles to create composite tools. This might not sound like a big deal, but it represents a significant leap in technology. A microlith knife or spear is more effective and easier to repair than a simple stone implement. If your blade breaks, you just replace the small stone component rather than having to craft an entirely new tool. It's the prehistoric equivalent of modular design, and it made life considerably easier for the people who figured it out. We also start to see evidence of long-distance trade, or at least long-distance movement of materials. Certain types of high-quality stone for toolmaking appear in sites far from their natural sources, suggesting that either people were travelling considerable distances to obtain these materials, or that there was some form of exchange network operating between different groups. Imagine that information becomes valuable. Maybe you trade for it, offering something you have in abundance: animal skins, dried fish, knowledge of good hunting grounds, in exchange for access to better stone. Suddenly you're not just surviving, you're engaging in economics. Admittedly, very basic economics without currency, receipts, or the ability to write angry reviews, but still it's the beginning of the complex trade networks that would later connect civilizations across continents. The transition from the Paleolithic to the Mesolithic period in India brought changes in climate and environment that forced further adaptations. As the last ice age ended, sea levels rose, coastlines shifted, and the distribution of flora and fauna changed. Some species of large game that had been staples of the hunter-gatherer diet became extinct or moved to different regions. The people had to adapt, shifting their focus to smaller game, increasing their reliance on plant foods, developing new hunting techniques. This period of environmental change might have been disruptive, but it also pushed human ingenuity. When your tried and true method of getting food stops working, you either innovate or you starve, and humans have historically been pretty good at choosing innovation over starvation. Some groups during this period began to show the earliest hints of sedentism, staying in one place for longer periods rather than constantly moving. This wasn't yet agriculture, but it was a step in that direction. Perhaps they found a location that was so rich in resources that it made sense to establish a more permanent camp. Maybe it was near a reliable water source with good fishing, surrounded by forests full of game and edible plants, in a climate that was pleasant year-round. Why wander if you found paradise? Of course, paradise in this context means a place where you probably won't starve and might not get eaten by a large predator, so let's not get too carried away with the imagery. But for people who had been nomadic for generations, the ability to stay in one place, to build more substantial shelters, to accumulate possessions without worrying about carrying them on the next migration, that must have felt revolutionary. These semi-sedentary groups represent a crucial bridge between the fully nomadic lifestyle of the deep prehistoric period and the agricultural settlements that would eventually emerge. They were experimenting, essentially figuring out new ways to organize their lives and extract resources from their environment. Some of these experiments worked better than others. Some groups probably found that settling down left them vulnerable to resource depletion, or made them targets for other groups. Others found that it allowed them to exploit their environment more efficiently, to build up food stores, to support slightly larger populations. It was a period of trial and error, of human societies testing different organizational strategies, and while we don't have written records documenting these experiments, the archaeological evidence shows us the results. The fascinating thing about studying this prehistoric period is how much we don't know and how much we're constantly learning. Every new archaeological excavation has the potential to rewrite our understanding of when certain developments occurred or how widespread certain practices were. A single well-preserved site can tell us more about daily life in prehistoric India than decades of speculation. Researchers use increasingly sophisticated techniques, radiocarbon dating, DNA analysis, microscopic examination of toolware patterns, isotope analysis to determine diet, to squeeze every possible bit of information from the scattered remains these ancient people left behind. It's like being a detective investigating a case where most of the evidence has been destroyed and the witnesses have been dead for 20,000 years. Not exactly easy work, but the glimpses we get into this distant past make it worthwhile. One thing that becomes clear when you study prehistoric India is that these weren't primitive people in the sense of being somehow less intelligent or capable than modern humans. They were us, just without the accumulated knowledge and technology of subsequent millennia. Put a baby from 30,000 years ago in a modern environment, raise them with modern education, and they'd be indistinguishable from anyone else. The difference isn't in capability but in context. These prehistoric peoples were working with the knowledge base they had, passed down through oral tradition and personal experience, and they were doing remarkably well with it. They were solving complex problems, how to find food in diverse environments, how to make effective tools from natural materials, how to organize their societies, how to understand and explain the world around them. The solutions they came up with might seem crude by modern standards, but they worked, which is all that mattered when the alternative was extinction. It's also worth noting that the descendants of these early Adivasi populations still exist in India today. They're not museum pieces or living fossils, they're modern people with their own complex contemporary identities, but they do represent a form of cultural continuity that stretches back into the deepest reaches of Indian prehistory. For much of Indian history, these communities were marginalized, pushed into less desirable lands by successive waves of migrants and empire builders. In the modern era, they face ongoing challenges related to land rights, cultural preservation, and socio-economic integration. But they're still there, still maintaining aspects of their ancient heritage, still reminding us that the story of India doesn't start with the Vedas or the Indus Valley civilization, but goes back much, much further into a time when the entire subcontinent was their home and theirs alone. The archaeological sites that give us our glimpses into this period are scattered across India. The Bhimbetka rock shelters in Madhya Pradesh, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, contain rock art that spans from the Upper Paleolithic period to the medieval period, an unbroken record of human artistic expression spanning tens of thousands of years. Looking at the paintings there, you can see the layers of history, earlier paintings overlaid with later ones, each generation adding to the visual record. In Rajasthan, sites along ancient river terraces have yielded extensive collections of stone tools showing the evolution of tool-making technology over millennia. In the south, along the coasts and in the interior, scattered finds tell us that human habitation was equally ancient there, though the tropical climate and acidic soils make preservation of organic materials nearly impossible. Every year brings new discoveries, new sites, new pieces of the puzzle. What's particularly striking when you look at the distribution of these prehistoric sites is how thoroughly humans had colonized the Indian subcontinent by the end of the Paleolithic period. There's basically no ecological zone that wasn't inhabited. Mountains, plains, forests, coasts, river valleys, even relatively inhospitable desert regions show evidence of human presence. These weren't a few isolated groups huddling in particularly favorable locations. This was a successful continent-wide human population that had figured out how to thrive in every available environment. The population density was certainly much lower than it would be in later periods, but the spatial distribution was remarkably complete. By the time agriculture arrived and began to transform human society, the groundwork was already laid. People were everywhere, and they knew their local environments intimately. The climate of prehistoric India wasn't static, of course. Over the tens of thousands of years we're discussing, there were significant climate fluctuations, periods of greater rainfall and periods of drought, times when the monsoons were stronger or weaker, shifts in temperature and vegetation patterns. Each of these changes would have affected the prehistoric inhabitants, forcing adaptations, perhaps triggering migrations, possibly contributing to the development of new technologies or social organizations. The people weren't passive victims of these environmental changes. They were active agents responding to challenges, taking advantage of opportunities, constantly adjusting their strategies for survival. In a sense, this period of prehistory was a long workshop in human adaptability, teaching lessons that would be built upon by every subsequent generation. One aspect in the historical periods we can document more clearly, we see women often relegated to subordinate social positions in many Indian societies. But in the prehistoric hunter-gatherer context, the dynamics were likely quite different. Women's role in gathering plant foods, which typically provided the majority of calories in hunter-gatherer diets, would have been absolutely crucial to group survival. The gathering of plant foods, the knowledge of which plants were edible and when they were available, the processing of these foods, this was skilled, essential work. Women also likely played important roles in the creation of baskets, clothing, and other tools necessary for daily life, in the care and education of children who represented the group's future, and quite possibly in the spiritual and ritual life of the community. The male-dominated narratives of history tend to focus on hunting and warfare, but in the prehistoric context, you could make a strong argument that gathering and the knowledge it required were at least as important as hunting to the survival and success of human groups. Children, they would have started learning survival skills from a very young age, how to identify edible plants, how to track animals, how to make and maintain tools, how to read weather patterns and navigate the landscape. This education would have been informal, learned through observation and participation rather than in any kind of formal schooling setting. But kids being kids, they probably also spent time playing, which in itself would have been a form of learning. Playing at hunting, practicing with miniature tools, exploring their environment, all of this play would have been preparing them for adult life while also being, fun. Because humans, even 30,000 years ago, were still humans, and human children have always found ways to play and have fun, even in circumstances that adults would find challenging. The elderly in these groups would have been invaluable repositories of knowledge. In a society without writing, the memories of older individuals represented the entire accumulated wisdom of the group. An elder who had lived through multiple cycles of plenty and scarcity, who remembered which strategies worked during the Great Drought 40 years ago, who knew the locations of water sources that only became apparent in certain conditions. That person was a survival asset for the entire group. This is probably why respect for elders is such a common feature across human cultures. It wasn't just nice manners, it was practical survival strategy. Though I imagine there were also prehistoric teenagers who rolled their eyes when the elders started going on about how much harder things were in the old days. Some things are probably universal across all human societies and time periods. As we reach the end of this deep dive into prehistoric India, it's worth pausing to appreciate the sheer span of time we've been discussing. 30,000 years is a difficult number to really comprehend. That's roughly 1,500 generations of humans, each living their lives, raising families, facing challenges, experiencing joys and sorrows, all without leaving any written record of their individual experiences. The overwhelming majority of human existence has been spent in conditions similar to what we've been describing. Small groups of people living close to nature, relying on their knowledge and skills to survive, creating culture and meaning in a world that was often harsh and unforgiving, but also filled with beauty and wonder if you knew where to look for it. These prehistoric peoples weren't just the prelude to the real history that comes later. They were the foundation upon which everything else was built. The genetic heritage of modern Indians includes their DNA. The landscape they lived in, they shaped through their use of fire, their hunting patterns, their gathering habits. The earliest layers of Indian culture, the deepest myths and stories, quite possibly have roots that extend back into this prehistoric period, passed down through such a long chain of oral tradition that their origins have been completely forgotten, even as the stories themselves survived in altered form. When agriculture finally arrived in the Indian subcontinent, whether developed independently or brought by new migrants, it didn't appear in an empty land. It arrived in a place that had been thoroughly humanized, where people had been living, thinking, creating and adapting for tens of thousands of years. The daily rhythm of life for these prehistoric groups would have been dictated by the sun, which is to say they didn't have the option of staying up until 3 in the morning binge-watching their favourite show. When the sun went down, you were pretty much done for the day unless you wanted to waste precious fire resources on staying up late. During certain times of the year, the entire group might participate in a large hunting expedition, working together to drive game animals toward waiting hunters or into natural traps. This kind of cooperative hunting required coordination, communication, and a deep understanding of animal behaviour. You couldn't just wander into the wilderness waving a stick and expect to come home with dinner. You needed strategy, patience, and quite a bit of luck. Other times, the group would split up, with hunting parties going in search of game while gathering parties, often primarily women and children, would fan out to collect plant foods, nuts, fruits, roots, and anything else edible that the landscape provided. The gatherers would need to know the territory intimately, understanding where different plants grew, when they were in season, how to process them to remove toxins or make them more palatable. Some plants required extensive processing before they could be eaten safely. Certain roots might need to be soaked, ground, and cooked to neutralize bitter or toxic compounds. This wasn't simple work. It was chemistry, learned through generations of trial and error, and probably a few unfortunate incidents where someone discovered the hard way that you really needed to process that root more thoroughly. The phrase, "what doesn't kill you makes you stronger," takes on a more literal meaning when you're learning which foods are safe to eat through direct experimentation. Fire was absolutely central to prehistoric life, and managing fire would have been one of the group's most important daily tasks. Fire provided warmth during cold nights, protection from predators who were sensibly afraid of it, light during the hours of darkness, and most importantly, a way to cook food. Cooking food isn't just about taste. It makes nutrients more accessible, kills parasites and bacteria, and allows humans to eat a wider variety of foods than we could consume raw. A group that lost its fire was in serious trouble. They would need to either make new fire through friction methods, which is difficult and time-consuming, or obtain fire from another group, which might or might not be an option depending on relationships with neighbouring groups. Fire was valuable enough that it was probably maintained continuously, with someone always responsible for keeping the embers alive, feeding the fire, protecting it from rain. It was like having a needy pet that would literally be the difference between life and death if it died. No pressure. The construction of shelters would have varied enormously depending on the environment and the season. In some areas and times of year, a simple windbreak or lean-to made from branches and leaves might be sufficient. In colder climates or during monsoon season, more substantial structures would be necessary, perhaps huts made from wooden frames covered with animal skins, bark, or woven plant materials. Some groups made use of natural shelters like rock overhangs or caves, though despite the popular image of cavemen, most prehistoric peoples didn't actually live in caves most of the time. Caves tended to be damp, dark, and already occupied by animals who weren't thrilled about the idea of human roommates. Rock shelters, shallow overhangs that provided protection from rain and sun but had more air circulation and light, were often preferred. But whether you were under a rock overhang or in a constructed hut, you were still dealing with a housing situation that would make modern college dorm rooms look luxurious. There was no running water, no heating or cooling, no protection from insects, and definitely no Wi-Fi. The amenities were, shall we say, limited. Tool maintenance would have been an ongoing concern. Stone tools might seem durable, but they dulled with use, chipped, or broke entirely. A broken spear point right when you needed it could mean the difference between eating and going hungry, so keeping tools in good repair was crucial. People would carry raw stone materials with them, constantly knapping new tools or resharpening existing ones. The sound of stone striking stone, someone working to create or repair a tool, would have been a common background noise in any camp. It's the prehistoric equivalent of someone constantly tinkering in their garage, except instead of working on a vintage car, they're making the implements they need to survive. Different types of stone had different properties. Flint was excellent for creating sharp edges. Obsidian was even sharper but more brittle. Quartzite was more durable but harder to work. Skilled toolmakers would have been highly valued members of the group, and their knowledge would have been carefully taught to the next generation. The question of what these people wore is an interesting one, and unfortunately clothing doesn't preserve well in the archaeological record, especially in tropical climates like much of India. We can make educated guesses based on later periods and on groups in similar environments. In warmer regions and seasons, clothing might have been minimal, perhaps simple wraps or loincloths made from plant fibres or animal skins. In cooler areas or during cold seasons, more substantial clothing made from animal hides would have been necessary. The processing of animal skins into usable leather or hide is itself a complex process requiring specific knowledge and considerable labour. There were various methods for doing this using natural materials: brains from the animal itself, tannins from certain plants, smoke. Again, this is sophisticated technology that took generations to develop and perfect. The first person who figured out that rubbing animal brains into a hide makes it soft and workable was a genius, though I imagine they discovered this accidentally, and the actual moment of discovery was probably pretty gross. Personal adornment was almost certainly practiced. We have evidence from prehistoric sites around the world of people creating beads from shells, stones, or teeth, piercing them and stringing them together to make necklaces or bracelets. This isn't just vanity. Personal adornment serves social functions, marking identity, status, achievements, or group affiliation. Even in the most basic subsistence situation, humans have consistently found time and resources to make themselves look good, or at least interesting. We're a vain species, and honestly, that's kind of charming. Imagine being a prehistoric human, your entire day consumed with the struggle to find enough food and stay alive, and still deciding that you need to make a necklace from shells because it looks nice. That's the human spirit right there. We don't just want to survive, we want to survive with style. Communication in these groups was obviously primarily verbal, but we shouldn't underestimate the sophistication of their spoken language. There's absolutely no reason to think that prehistoric peoples had simpler or less developed languages than modern humans. The capacity for complex language is hardwired into human brains, and has been for at least 50,000 years, probably longer. These people would have had fully developed languages with complex grammar, extensive vocabulary, and the ability to express abstract thoughts and ideas. They could tell stories, make jokes, argue about where to go next, teach complex skills through verbal instruction, describe events from the past, and speculate about the future. The languages they spoke are completely lost to us. No writing means no preservation, but they were every bit as real and as sophisticated as any modern language. Unfortunately, we can't even reconstruct them because they left no descendants that we can trace through comparative linguistics. It's like an entire universe of human expression that existed, flourished, and then vanished without a trace. Conflict and cooperation between different groups were both part of the prehistoric reality. Hunter-gatherer groups typically have territories that they range over, areas that they know well and exploit for resources. When territories overlapped or resources became scarce, there was potential for conflict. Archaeological evidence from various prehistoric sites around the world shows signs of violence. Skeletal remains with injuries that couldn't have been accidental, weapon points embedded in bones, signs of defensive structures. But there's also evidence of cooperation, of trade and exchange, of groups interacting peacefully and sharing knowledge. The reality was probably complex, varying based on circumstances. When resources were abundant, cooperation and trade might flourish. When times were hard and survival was uncertain, competition and conflict might increase. Different groups probably had different reputations, some known for being friendly and open to trade, others known for being aggressive and territorial. You had to be diplomatic, careful about approaching unfamiliar groups, attentive to signs of hostility or welcome. Getting this wrong could have fatal consequences, so reading social situations wasn't just a nice skill to have, it was a survival necessity. Disease would have been a constant challenge, though the disease landscape would have been very different from what humans would face later. Many of the crowd diseases that would devastate civilizations, smallpox, measles, cholera, require large, dense populations to sustain transmission chains, and probably didn't exist yet or existed only in animal reservoirs. But prehistoric peoples certainly dealt with injuries, infections, parasites, and various other health problems. A serious injury that today would be easily treatable could be a death sentence. A broken leg that doesn't heal properly could leave you unable to keep up with the group, which in a nomadic society is a serious problem. Tooth decay, arthritis, complications from childbirth, parasitic infections from contaminated water or undercooked food. The list of potential health issues was extensive, and the medical toolkit was limited to whatever could be done with herbal remedies, basic surgery using stone tools and hoping for the best. Life expectancy was considerably shorter than today, though not as short as is sometimes claimed. If you survived childhood, which admittedly was a big if, you had a reasonable chance of living into your 40s or 50s, maybe longer if you were lucky. Nobody was making it to retirement, but then again, there was no retirement to make it to. You worked until you couldn't, and then you relied on the group to take care of you, which they generally did because that's how human societies work when you can't just abandon people without abandoning your own humanity. The seasonal movements of these groups would have created something like an annual circuit, a regular pattern of migration that took advantage of different resources at different times of the year. Perhaps you spent the wet season in one area where fish were abundant and plant foods were easily gathered, then moved to higher ground during the peak of the monsoons, then shifted to a different region for the dry season where particular game animals congregated near permanent water sources. These patterns would have been passed down through generations, refined and adjusted based on experience. The elders would know the route, would know the landmarks, would know where to expect water and food at different times. Disruptions to these patterns, a drought that dried up an expected water source, a fire that destroyed a forest you normally hunted in, another group claiming territory you usually used, would require adaptation and decision-making. Sometimes these decisions would work out well, sometimes they wouldn't, and the groups that made better decisions more consistently were the ones that survived and thrived. The relationship between humans and animals during this period was complex. Animals were food sources, certainly, but they were also competitors, predators, and probably the subjects of spiritual significance. The rock art showing animals isn't just documentary. It seems to have ritual significance in many cases, possibly related to hunting magic or to beliefs about the spiritual power of animals. Some animals would have been particularly feared. Large predators like tigers and leopards that could hunt humans as effectively as humans hunted them. Others would have been particularly valued. Deer and wild cattle that provided substantial amounts of meat, fish that could be caught in large numbers during certain seasons, birds whose feathers could be used for adornment or whose eggs provided concentrated nutrition. The knowledge, in a sense, prehistoric peoples were amateur ecologists, understanding the web of relationships between different species in the environment because their survival depended on this understanding. Childbirth and child-rearing in this context would have been both easier and harder than in later agricultural societies. Easier because the relatively low population density meant that epidemic diseases were less common, and because the mobile lifestyle and varied diet might have provided better overall nutrition than early agricultural diets that were often heavily dependent on a single crop. Harder because medical intervention for complications was extremely limited, because infant mortality was probably quite high, and because raising children while moving regularly from place to place created its own challenges. Women probably spaced their children several years apart, which is common in hunter-gatherer societies, where you can't effectively carry more than one young child during migrations. Various factors including extended breastfeeding, the physical demands of the lifestyle, and possibly deliberate population control practices would have contributed to this spacing. Children who were born would have been raised by the entire community to some extent, learning from multiple adults and older children, which probably provided them with a broader education in different skills and knowledge than if they learned only from their immediate parents. The concept of property in these societies would have been very different from modern notions. Personal possessions would have been limited to what you could carry, perhaps some tools, a weapon, clothing, maybe a few items of personal significance like decorative objects or materials for making fire. Anything you couldn't carry was by definition not worth having in a nomadic lifestyle, which tends to eliminate the accumulation of stuff that characterizes more settled societies. You couldn't be materialistic when materialism literally weighed you down. Resources like water sources, good hunting grounds, or productive gathering areas might be considered group property in some sense, but the concept of land ownership as we understand it probably didn't exist. Land wasn't something you owned. It was something you moved through, you used. You had rights to based on tradition and usage, but not in the sense of exclusive permanent ownership. This would change dramatically with the advent of agriculture. But for these prehistoric peoples, the earth wasn't property to be bought and sold. It was simply home. Entertainment and leisure time are aspects of prehistoric life that are easy to overlook when we're focused on survival. But humans need more than just food and shelter. We need social interaction, mental stimulation, fun. Storytelling would have been a major form of entertainment, a way to pass knowledge between generations, to create shared cultural identity, to make sense of the world. Stories about great hunts, about encounters with dangerous animals, about ancestor spirits, about the origins of the world and the reasons things are the way they are. Music too, probably. The human voice can make music without any instruments, and even simple percussion instruments from natural materials can create complex rhythms. Dancing, games, competitions of skill, perhaps early forms of sport or contests. These weren't luxuries that could only be afforded once basic needs were met. They were part of what made life worth living, part of what bound the group together, part of what made humans human rather than just another animal species trying to survive. The gradual improvements in technology over this long prehistoric period are easy to miss because they happened so slowly. Over thousands of years, tool designs became more efficient, hunting techniques became more sophisticated, knowledge of plants and their uses became more comprehensive. Each generation made tiny improvements, added slightly to the body of knowledge, passed on slightly better techniques to their children. From our perspective, looking back, the progress seems glacial, but from the perspective of the people living through it, each improvement was significant. A better spearpoint design that made hunting more successful could mean the difference between feast and famine. A new technique for processing a previously inedible plant could open up a new food source. The discovery of a better route between seasonal camps could save days of travel. These weren't just minor optimizations. They were the accumulated wisdom of generations, each building on the last, slowly improving the human condition, even in the absence of writing or formal institutions for preserving and transmitting knowledge. As we approach the end of this prehistoric period, we can see the stage being set for dramatic changes. The climate had stabilized after the end of the last ice age. Human populations had grown and spread. Knowledge, the toolkit of skills and technologies available to humans, had expanded significantly. And somewhere, whether in India itself or in regions to the northwest, people were beginning to experiment with a revolutionary new way of life, agriculture. But that transformation didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen everywhere at once. For thousands of years, agricultural peoples and hunter-gatherers coexisted, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not, each lifestyle having its advantages and disadvantages. The transition from this prehistoric period to the protohistoric and then historic periods didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process that unfolded over thousands of years, with different regions moving at different paces. But that's a story for the next chapter. For now, let's just acknowledge these ancient inhabitants of India, the Adivasi peoples who were the true pioneers of the subcontinent. They survived ice ages and climate shifts. They spread across an entire subcontinent and adapted to every environment it offered. They created art and culture and knowledge systems that allowed them to thrive in a world without agriculture, writing, or any of the technological advantages we take for granted. They were our ancestors, in the broadest sense, the people who proved that humans could make a home anywhere if they were clever and adaptable enough. And they did all of this while dealing with predators, diseases, injuries, and natural disasters without any of the support systems that later civilizations would develop. No hospitals, no insurance, no emergency services, just knowledge, skill, community, and an impressive amount of stubbornness. If that's not worthy of respect, I don't know what is. Now, if you thought the prehistoric period was impressive, buckle up because we're about to jump into something that would make those ancient hunter-gatherers absolutely lose their minds. Somewhere around 3300 BCE, while most of the world was still figuring out the basics of farming and maybe building some simple mud huts, the Indus Valley decided to just skip ahead a few chapters in the Civilization Handbook and create one of the most sophisticated urban cultures the Bronze Age had ever seen. We're talking about the Indus Valley Civilization, also called the Harappan Civilization, and it's one of those historical phenomena that makes you wonder if maybe we've been giving ancient peoples way too little credit all along. The Indus Valley Civilization emerged in what's now Pakistan and northwestern India, centered around the Indus River and its tributaries. This wasn't some small settlement of farmers who got a bit ambitious. This was a full-scale urban civilization spanning an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Let that sink in for a moment. While the Egyptians were building pyramids and the Mesopotamians were inventing writing, the Indus Valley people were quietly constructing an entire network of sophisticated cities across an area of about 1.25 million square kilometers. They weren't showing off about it. They weren't carving their kings' faces into mountains. They were just efficiently going about the business of being remarkably advanced. It's the ancient equivalent of that person in class who never raises their hand but gets perfect scores on every exam. The two most famous cities of this civilization are Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, which were discovered in the 1920s and promptly made archaeologists reconsider everything they thought they knew about ancient South Asia. When excavations began at these sites, what emerged from the earth was shocking. These weren't the remains of primitive settlements. These were planned cities with grid layouts, standardized brick sizes, sophisticated drainage systems, and multi-story buildings. We're talking about urban planning from 2500 BCE that would make many modern city planners jealous. The street buildings were constructed using uniform baked bricks, not just mud bricks that would dissolve in the rain, but properly fired bricks that could last for millennia. Which they did, obviously, since we're still digging them up today. But the really mind-blowing part, the drainage system. Every house in these cities had its own bathroom and toilet, connected to a sophisticated sewage system with covered drains running along the streets. Let me repeat that for emphasis. They had indoor plumbing in 2500 BCE. The average medieval European city, some 3,000 years later, would have been an absolute cesspool by comparison, with people just throwing their waste out into the streets and hoping for the best. But they were maintaining their sewers in the Bronze Age. The Romans get all the credit for this stuff, but the Indus Valley people were doing it more than a millennium earlier and arguably doing it better. Unfortunately, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and the humble sanitation engineer gets forgotten by history. The houses themselves were quite impressive. Most were 2 stories tall, built around a central courtyard that provided light and ventilation. The ground floor typically had thick walls and few windows facing the street, which provided privacy and helped keep the interior cool during the brutal summer heat. Try finding air conditioning in 2500 BCE, not happening. So you had to rely on architectural tricks like thick walls, strategic window placement, and courtyards to manage temperature. The wealthier residences were larger, with more rooms, better finishing, and sometimes even their own wells. But what's really interesting is that there wasn't an enormous disparity between rich and poor houses. Sure, some were bigger and fancier than others, but you didn't have the situation you see in many ancient cities where the elite are living in palaces while everyone else is crammed into hovels. The Indus Valley cities suggest a relatively egalitarian society, at least by ancient standards, which is unusual and frankly kind of refreshing. One of the most iconic structures from this civilization is the Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro, a large rectangular public pool that was waterproofed with bitumen and accessed by steps from either end. The purpose of this structure is debated. Was it for ritual bathing, public hygiene, or just the Bronze Age equivalent of a community swimming pool? We don't know for certain, but given that ritual bathing is a major part of later Indian religious practice, particularly in Hinduism, it's tempting to see this as an early example of that tradition. Imagine the conversations around the Great Bath. Nice day for a ritual purification. Indeed, the water's perfect. Did you hear about the new drainage system on 3rd Street? Absolutely top-notch craftsmanship. The mundane and the sacred existing side by side in a way that would characterize Indian culture for millennia to come. The economy of the Indus Valley civilization was sophisticated and far-reaching. These people were producing high-quality goods, cotton textiles, pottery, metal tools and ornaments, carved stone seals, and trading them across a vast network that extended to Mesopotamia, Central Asia, and possibly even further. We know this because Indus Valley artifacts have been found in Mesopotamian sites, and Mesopotamian goods have been found in Indus cities. Ancient cuneiform texts from Mesopotamia mention trade with a land called Meluha, which scholars believe was their name for the Indus region. So you had merchants making the long, dangerous journey between these civilizations, probably complaining the whole way about the heat, the bandits, the quality of the camels, and the exchange rates, because some things are universal across all times and cultures. Agriculture was the foundation of the economy naturally. The Indus Valley people grew wheat, barley, peas, sesame seeds, and various other crops. They were among the first to cultivate cotton, turning it into textiles that became a major trade good. Cotton fabric from India would remain highly prized for thousands of years. The Romans would later be so obsessed with Indian cotton that it contributed to the drain of Roman silver to India. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The point is, these people figured out how to grow, process, and weave cotton into cloth, which is not a simple process. You can't just pick cotton and wear it. It requires ginning to remove the seeds, carding to align the fibres, spinning to create thread, and weaving to create fabric. That's a whole technological chain that someone had to invent and perfect. Animal domestication was also practiced extensively. They raised cattle, water buffalo, sheep, goats, and pigs. Notably, they also had domesticated chickens, which might seem mundane but actually represents one of the early instances of chicken domestication in the world. Thanks, Indus Valley people, for your contribution to the global spread of chickens, without which we wouldn't have Eggs Benedict or chicken tikka masala, both of which are clearly crucial to modern civilization. There's also evidence they had dogs and cats as domesticated animals, because even ancient urban societies apparently couldn't resist the appeal of pet ownership. Nothing says advanced civilization quite like dedicating resources to feeding an animal whose primary function is to judge you silently while you're trying to work. Now the people of this civilization developed a writing system, which we can see on numerous seals, tablets, and pottery fragments. The problem is we can't read it. Despite decades of effort by numerous scholars, the Indus script remains undeciphered. We don't know what language it represents, how to pronounce it, or what any of it actually says. The inscriptions are typically short, usually just a few symbols, which makes decipherment even harder because you need longer text to identify patterns and grammar. It's like trying to learn a language, but you only have access to business cards and product labels. You might figure out a few words, but good luck understanding the grammar or making coherent sentences. The seals themselves are fascinating objects. They're small, typically square, usually made from steatite and carved with various images and script. Common motifs include animals, bulls, elephants, tigers, unicorn-like creatures, and occasionally human or deity-like figures. One of the most famous is the Pashupati seal, which shows a figure seated in what looks like a yogic posture, surrounded by animals. Some scholars see this as a proto-Shiva figure, an early version of the Hindu god associated with yoga and animals. Others are more cautious about drawing such connections. The truth is, without being able to read what the seals say, we're essentially guessing about their meaning and purpose based on the images alone. It's like trying to understand modern culture by looking at corporate logos without being able to read the text. You might get some general ideas, but you'd miss most of the important details. The mystery of the Indus script is particularly maddening because if we could read it, we'd know so much more about this civilization. Who ruled these cities? Were there kings, councils, or some other form of government? What did they believe about gods, the afterlife, the nature of reality? What were their laws, their stories, their poetry? All of that knowledge is locked away in these undeciphered symbols taunting us from across the millennia. Scholars have proposed hundreds of different interpretations and decipherment attempts, but none have gained widespread acceptance. The script will likely remain a mystery unless we either find a bilingual text, something written in both Indus script and a known language, like the Rosetta Stone that unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphics, or develop some revolutionary new approach to decipherment. So far, neither has happened, which means we're stuck making educated guesses about one of the world's most advanced ancient civilizations. Another puzzling aspect of the Indus Valley civilization is the apparent absence of monumental architecture devoted to rulers or warfare. Most ancient civilizations left behind palaces, temples, fortifications, or monuments glorifying their kings and gods. The Egyptians had pyramids. The Mesopotamians had ziggurats. Later civilizations would have all manner of impressive buildings dedicated to showing off how important the rulers were. But in Indus cities we don't find that. There are large public buildings that might have been administrative centers or granaries, and there's the Great Bath, but nothing that screams, "Look at how powerful our king is." There's also very little evidence of warfare. Few weapons, no depictions of battles, no fortifications that look designed to withstand military assault. This is other scholars are more skeptical, pointing out that the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Maybe they had weapons made from perishable materials, or maybe the archaeological record just hasn't revealed military aspects of their society yet. The peaceful civilization theory is attractive, and certainly the Indus people seem to have been less obsessed with warfare and glorifying rulers than many of their contemporaries, but we should be cautious about idealizing them too much. They were humans, and humans have a depressingly consistent track record of finding reasons to fight each other. Still, it's notable that their cities don't seem to have been organized primarily around military or royal power, the way so many ancient cities were. Their priorities seem to have been more practical: functional infrastructure, efficient trade, comfortable housing, and really excellent sewage systems. Not as dramatic as massive pyramids, perhaps, but probably more useful for the average citizen's day-to-day quality of life. The decline of the Indus Valley civilization around 1900 BCE is another mystery, though we have better theories about this than we do about their writing system. It wasn't a sudden catastrophic collapse. The civilization gradually faded over several centuries. People abandoned the cities, moving to smaller rural settlements. Why? Climate change is one major suspect. There's evidence that the monsoon patterns shifted, leading to either increased flooding or reduced rainfall depending on the region. The Indus River may have changed course, which would have been catastrophic for cities dependent on it for water and trade. If your entire civilization is built around a river system, and that river decides to go somewhere else, you're in trouble. It's the Bronze Age equivalent of your landlord suddenly deciding to demolish your apartment building with no advance notice. There's also evidence of increased aridity in the region, turning formerly productive agricultural land into less hospitable terrain. When agriculture fails, cities that depend on agricultural surplus to feed their populations are in deep trouble. You can have the best urban planning in the world, but if you can't grow enough food to feed everyone, the city isn't going to last. Trade networks also seem to have broken down around this time. The long-distance trade with Mesopotamia declined significantly, possibly because Mesopotamia was having its own problems and wasn't buying as much, or because the overland and maritime routes became less safe or practical. When your economy is built on producing goods for export, losing your export markets is a serious blow. Some older theories suggested that invading Aryans destroyed the Indus Valley civilization, but this theory has fallen out of favour. The timeline doesn't work quite right. The archaeological evidence doesn't support a sudden violent conquest, and the whole idea was probably influenced by colonial-era assumptions about advanced civilizations from the West conquering primitive Eastern cultures. The reality seems to be that the Indus civilization declined for environmental and economic reasons, and that the gradual arrival of Indo-Aryan-speaking peoples into the region was a separate later process that happened as the urban culture was already fading. It's messier and less dramatic than a barbarian invasion destroying a great civilization, but history often is messy and undramatic when you look at it closely. By around 1300 BCE, the urban phase of the Indus Valley civilization was essentially over. The cities were abandoned or greatly reduced, the sophisticated infrastructure fell into disrepair, the writing system was forgotten, and the trade networks dissolved. People continued living in the region, of course. They didn't all disappear, but they reverted to smaller-scale rural village life. The Indus Valley civilization was lost to history for thousands of years until archaeologists rediscovered it in the modern era. Imagine building one of the world's most impressive ancient civilizations, complete with indoor plumbing and urban planning that wouldn't be matched for millennia, and then being completely forgotten. Not even getting a mention in later historical texts, just vanishing from human memory while other, arguably less impressive civilizations got all the attention. It's a bit insulting, really, but that's history for you. Not always fair about who gets remembered. Now, as the urban centres of the Indus Valley were declining, something else was happening in the region. New people were talking about the Indo-Aryans, and their arrival marks the beginning of what's called the Vedic period, named after the Vedas, the sacred texts that would be composed during this era. This is where things get complicated, controversial, and really interesting, so let's dive in. The story traditionally told is that Indo-Aryan-speaking peoples migrated into the Indian subcontinent from the northwest, possibly from Central Asia, around 1500 BCE. They spoke an early form of Sanskrit, an Indo-European language related to Persian, Greek, Latin, and a whole host of other languages spanning from Ireland to India. The movement of these peoples is part of the broader Indo-European migrations that saw related groups spreading across huge swathes of Eurasia. These weren't necessarily massive invasions. Think more like gradual migrations of pastoral peoples with their herds, spreading over generations, intermingling with local populations, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. The details are debated intensely because this period doesn't have written historical records that we can read. We're dependent on archaeology, linguistics, and later texts that were composed centuries after the events they might be describing. The Vedas themselves, the sacred texts that define this period, weren't written down initially. They were composed orally and transmitted from teacher to student through incredibly precise memorization techniques. The oldest Veda, the Rig Veda, is a collection of over 1,000 hymns, prayers, and ritual texts dedicated to various deities. These hymns were composed over a period of several centuries, probably beginning around 1500 BCE, maybe earlier. They're in an archaic form of Sanskrit that's so old and complex that even later Sanskrit speakers needed commentaries to fully understand it. Imagine a religious text so ancient that it's written in a version of your language that you can barely comprehend, and you'll get some sense of how old we're talking here. It's as if modern English speakers tried to read the earliest Old English texts without any training. You'd recognize that it's somehow related to your language, but actually understanding it would be nearly impossible. The society described in the early Vedic texts is very different from the urban Indus Valley civilization. The Vedic peoples were primarily pastoral, focused on cattle herding and agriculture, living in tribal societies organized around kinship groups. Cattle were particularly important. They were wealth, they were currency, they were religiously significant. A person's status was often measured by how many cattle they owned. Raids to steal cattle from rival tribes were apparently quite common, and many Vedic hymns ask the gods for success in battle and the acquisition of cattle. It's like if modern society measured wealth in cows and people regularly fought wars to steal each other's herds. Actually, given some of the reasons humans fight wars, cattle theft might be one of the more reasonable motivations. At least you can eat a cow. The religious world of the Vedic peoples was polytheistic, populated by a complex pantheon of deities associated with natural forces and cosmic principles. Indra, the warrior god associated with thunder and rain, gets more hymns dedicated to him in the Rig Veda than any other deity. He's depicted as a heavy drinker of soma, a ritual beverage whose exact identity is now lost, but which was definitely some kind of intoxicant, and a mighty warrior who slays demons and defeats enemies. Agni, the fire god, was crucial because fire was essential to Vedic rituals. Varuna was associated with cosmic order and the sky. Surya was the sun god. And there were dozens of others, each with their own characteristics, myths and ritual functions. The gods weren't particularly interested in morality in the later philosophical sense. They wanted proper rituals, correct recitation of hymns, and generous offerings. Perform the rituals correctly, and the gods would grant you success, health, wealth, and victory over your enemies. Mess up the rituals and, well, don't be surprised when things go badly. Their idea of customer service was very much, give us what we want, perform the proper procedures, and maybe we'll help you out. The rituals themselves became increasingly complex over time, requiring priests who had memorized vast amounts of material and knew the proper procedures for different ceremonies. These priests, called Brahmins, formed one of the major social categories in Vedic society. The early Vedic social structure recognized broad categories that would later crystallize into the rigid caste system, but in the early period things were somewhat more fluid. You had the Brahmins, the priestly class responsible for rituals and preserving sacred knowledge. You had the Kshatriyas, the warrior class who were rulers and fighters. You had the Vaishyas, who were farmers, herders and traders. And you had the Shudras, who were labourers and servants. This fourfold division, called the Varna system, would become increasingly rigid over time, but in the early Vedic period, there seems to have been more mobility between categories than there would be later. Below even the Shudras were people who weren't part of the Varna system at all, the people who would later be called untouchables or Dalits. These were often the indigenous peoples who had been conquered or displaced by the arriving Indo-Aryans, forced into the lowest social positions or pushed outside of society entirely. The texts don't talk much about them because the texts were composed by the Brahmins, who had no interest in giving voice to the people at the bottom of the social hierarchy. But they were there, doing the necessary but ritually impure work, dealing with leather, cleaning, disposing of the dead, work that other people needed done but didn't want to do themselves. The caste system would become one of the most distinctive and controversial aspects of Indian society, creating a social structure that was remarkably persistent and difficult to change. Even today, thousands of years later, caste remains a significant factor in Indian society despite legal prohibitions against caste discrimination. When you create a social hierarchy and then religiously sanctify it, claiming it's part of the cosmic order established by the gods themselves, it turns out to be really hard to dismantle later. Who knew? The position of women in Vedic society is a complex and sometimes contradictory topic. Some Vedic hymns were composed by women, and there are examples of learned women who participated in philosophical debates. Women could inherit property, at least in some circumstances. But there were also clear restrictions and inequalities. As the Vedic period progressed and society became more settled and stratified, women's freedoms seemed to have decreased. By the later Vedic period, women's roles were becoming more restricted to domestic spheres, their education was being limited, and practices like child marriage were emerging. It's a reminder that ancient tradition doesn't mean unchanging. Societies evolve and not always in directions that benefit everyone. You can practically see the patriarchy crystallizing over time through the texts. The later Vedic period, roughly 1000 to 600 BCE, saw significant changes in society and religion. The peoples were becoming more settled, agriculture was intensifying, iron tools were coming into use, and larger political units were forming. The simple tribal structures were evolving into early kingdoms. The religious rituals were becoming more elaborate and expensive, requiring more specialized knowledge and longer training for priests. This period produced 3 more collections of Vedic hymns, the Samaveda, Yajurveda, and Atharveda, as well as numerous prose texts called Brahmanas, that explain the rituals in exhaustive, sometimes mind-numbing detail. Reading the Brahmanas is like reading an extremely detailed instruction manual for religious ceremonies that you're never going to perform. First, you construct the altar with precisely 10,800 bricks arranged in exactly this configuration while reciting these specific verses. Then you pour clarified butter into the fire while facing east and thinking pure thoughts. Then it goes on, and on, and on. The level of detail is impressive, but you can't help thinking that maybe the religion was getting a bit out of hand when you needed a PhD-level education just to perform a sacrifice correctly. But here's where it gets really interesting. Toward the end of the Vedic period, some people started asking bigger questions. The rituals were all well and good, but what did they actually mean? What was the nature of reality? What happened after death? How should one live a good life? These philosophical questionings led to the composition of the Upanishads, texts that represent a major shift in Indian religious and philosophical thought. The Upanishads move away from the focus on rituals and begin exploring metaphysical concepts that would become central to Hindu philosophy. The nature of ultimate reality, Brahman, the individual soul, Atman, the relationship between the two, the cycle of death and rebirth, samsara, the law of cause and effect governing rebirth, karma, and the possibility of liberation from the cycle, moksha. These are big ideas, the kind of philosophical concepts that people would spend the next several thousand years debating, elaborating, and interpreting. The Upanishads weren't systematic philosophy. They're more like records of various teachers explaining their insights to students, often through dialogues and stories. Different Upanishads sometimes contradict each other, which is fine because these weren't meant to be dogmatic statements of fixed doctrine, but explorations of profound questions. One of the most famous teachings from the Upanishads is Tattvamasi, that thou art. The idea that the individual self and the ultimate reality are fundamentally identical, that the deepest essence of your being is the same as the deepest essence of the universe itself. That's either an incredibly profound spiritual insight or the ultimate form of narcissism, depending on how you interpret it. Probably the former, but you can see how it might be confusing. The concept of karma is particularly important and would become central to Indian religious thought. In its earliest usage, karma just meant action or deed, particularly ritual action. But it evolved to mean something more. The idea that your actions have consequences that extend beyond this life, determining the nature of your future rebirths. Good actions lead to good rebirths. Bad actions lead to bad rebirths, and the whole system operates according to natural law, not dependent on the whims of gods. On one hand, this creates a strong incentive for ethical behavior. On the other hand, it can be used to justify the caste system. People are in lower castes because of bad karma from past lives, which is obviously problematic. Like many profound ideas, karma is philosophically interesting but can be socially weaponized in unfortunate ways. The concept of reincarnation, the cycle of death and rebirth called samsara, is another major development of this period. Earlier Vedic texts don't really emphasize reincarnation. They talk about an afterlife in heaven with the gods or with ancestors, but not this endless cycle of rebirth. But by the time of the Upanishads, reincarnation is central to the worldview. You're born, you live, you die, and then you're reborn in a new body. Human, animal, maybe even as a god or a plant, depending on your karma. This cycle continues indefinitely until you achieve liberation, moksha, which means escaping the cycle entirely and merging with ultimate reality. It's a very different vision of human existence than you find in most Western religions, where you typically get one life followed by eternal heaven or hell. In the Indian vision, you get many chances, but you're also stuck in the cycle for potentially millions of lifetimes if you don't figure out how to escape it. It's simultaneously more forgiving, you can always try again, and more terrifying. You might be stuck in this for a really long time. This period also saw the development of early yoga, though not the kind you see in modern yoga studios. Vedic yoga was more about mental discipline and meditation techniques aimed at controlling the mind and achieving spiritual insight. The physical postures that are such a big part of modern yoga came much later. Early yoga was about sitting still, controlling your breathing, focusing your attention, and trying to quiet the constant chatter of thoughts to achieve a state of profound meditative absorption. This is harder than it sounds. Try sitting completely still and thinking about nothing for 10 minutes. Go ahead, I'll wait. Back already? Yeah, the mind doesn't like being quiet. It wants to. Getting it to shut up and focus is serious work, which is why yogic meditation was considered an advanced spiritual practice, requiring years of training under a qualified teacher. The transition from the early Vedic period focused on ritual and sacrifice to the later period focused on philosophical inquiry and meditation represents a major intellectual shift. It's not that rituals disappeared. They remained important in Hinduism and still are today, but they were joined and sometimes overshadowed by this new emphasis on individual spiritual knowledge and direct experience of truth. You didn't necessarily need priests to perform elaborate sacrifices. You could, at least in theory, achieve spiritual liberation through your own effort, knowledge, and meditation. This was potentially democratizing, though in practice most people couldn't afford to spend years in meditation when they had fields to plough and mouths to feed. The renunciant lifestyle, leaving normal society to focus entirely on spiritual practice, became an option for some, but it wasn't for everyone. By the end of the Vedic period, around 600 BCE, the religious and philosophical foundations of what would become Hinduism were largely established. The Vedas had been composed and were being meticulously preserved through oral transmission. The Upanishads had introduced profound philosophical concepts. The caste system was becoming more rigid and more religiously justified. The large political structures that would become the kingdoms and republics of ancient India were forming. The stage was set for the next major development, the emergence of new religious movements that would challenge Vedic orthodoxy and offer alternative paths to spiritual liberation. Buddhism and Jainism were on the horizon, along with various other philosophical and religious schools. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. What's remarkable about this Vedic period is how much of what was established then continues to influence India and the world today. The Sanskrit language, though no longer spoken as a primary language, remains important for religious and scholarly purposes. The Vedas are still considered sacred by Hindus. The concepts of karma, reincarnation, yoga, and meditation that emerged during this period have spread far beyond India and influenced spiritual seekers worldwide. The caste system, despite legal prohibitions and social reforms, still affects Indian society. The philosophical debates that began in the Upanishads continue in various forms today. Not bad for a civilization that started with cattle herders composing hymns to their gods while sitting around campfires several thousand years ago. They couldn't have known that their hymns and ideas would still be discussed, debated, and revered millennia later. But then again, whoever knows what long-term impact their work will have? The Vedic sages were trying to understand reality, preserve their traditions, and maybe get the gods to send some rain and help them win cattle raids. The fact that their efforts created a philosophical and religious framework that would shape billions of lives across thousands of years was probably not what they had in mind. But that's the thing about profound ideas. Once they're out there, they take on a life of their own, evolving and spreading in ways their original creators never anticipated. The Vedic period gave India and the world some very profound ideas indeed, even if it took centuries for those ideas to fully develop and be understood. Not a bad legacy for a group of ancient poets and priests who just wanted to talk to the gods and figure out what this whole existence thing was really about. Let's go back for a moment to talk more about daily life in these Indus Valley cities, because the sophistication of their urban existence deserves more attention. The standardization we see across Indus cities is absolutely remarkable. Not just the bricks being uniform in size, though that's impressive enough, but weights and measures were standardized across the entire civilization. Archaeologists have found numerous sets of precisely graduated weights, made from various stones, following a binary system. This means you could trade in Harappa using the same weight standards that applied in Mohenjo-Daro, hundreds of kilometers away. Imagine the level of organization required to maintain standardized weights and measures across such a vast area without modern communication or transportation infrastructure. It's the kind of thing that makes running a multi-state business in the modern era look straightforward by comparison. At least we have phones and overnight shipping. The craft specialization in these cities was highly developed. There were areas of cities dedicated to specific crafts: beadmaking, pottery, metalworking, shellworking. The beadmakers of the Indus Valley produced carnelian beads of extraordinary quality, drilling perfectly straight holes through them using some kind of drill technology that we're still not entirely sure about. These beads have been found as far away as Mesopotamia, evidence of both their quality and the extensive trade networks. The shell, even in 2500 BCE, people cared about looking good. You can take the human out of the Stone Age, but you can't take the desire for nice accessories out of the human. Pottery was another major industry. Indus pottery was made on the wheel. They had the potter's wheel, that crucial ceramic technology that makes producing large quantities of uniform vessels much easier than hand building everything. The pottery was typically red with black geometric patterns or depictions of animals and plants. It's not as fancy as Greek black figure pottery or Chinese porcelain, but it's well made, functional, and often quite attractive. The shapes were standardized, suggesting mass production for common household needs as well as for trade. You could walk into what was essentially a Bronze Age pottery store and choose from various standardized sizes and shapes of pots, bowls, and jars. The ancient equivalent of IKEA, minus the inexplicable Swedish meatballs and the furniture that requires 3 hours and questionable instructions to assemble. Metalworking was quite advanced. The Indus people worked with copper and bronze, creating tools, weapons, vessels, and ornamental objects. They also had gold, silver, and lead. The metallurgical knowledge required to create bronze, which is an alloy of copper and tin, and to work with these materials to create useful objects is considerable. You need to know where to find ore, how to extract metal from ore, what temperatures are required for melting and casting, how to shape and finish the metal objects. This knowledge was probably closely guarded by specialized craftspeople who passed it down through apprenticeship systems. You didn't just pick up metalworking as a hobby. It was serious skilled labor requiring years of training and experience. Though at least if you messed up a project, you could melt it down and try again, which is more than you can say for a lot of crafts. Ruined a clay pot after spending hours on it? Too bad, it's trash now. Ruined a metal ornament? Melt it and start over. The recycling potential alone makes metalworking appealing. The agricultural base supporting these cities was substantial. The fertile floodplains of the Indus and its tributaries provided excellent agricultural land when properly managed. The people developed sophisticated irrigation systems to bring water to their fields and to manage the annual flooding cycle. They built wells, reservoirs, and channels. Some of the wells in Indus cities are so deep and well constructed that they remained in use for centuries, possibly millennia. Digging a well by hand using Bronze Age tools is not a weekend DIY project. It's a major engineering undertaking requiring planning, labour, and significant skill. The fact that these cities had numerous wells, many of them quite deep, speaks to both their technical capabilities and their commitment to ensuring reliable water supplies. Because in a region where the monsoons determine whether you feast or starve, having control over your water supply isn't optional. It's the difference between a thriving city and a ghost town. The decline of this remarkable civilization is even more poignant when you consider just how advanced it was. Then, over the course of a few centuries, it all fell apart. The cities were abandoned, the systems broke down, the knowledge was lost. Later, peoples living in the region had no idea that there had once been great cities beneath their feet. It would be like if modern civilization collapsed and 1,000 years from now, people were living in primitive villages among the ruins of skyscrapers, having completely forgotten that their ancestors once had electricity, internet, and indoor plumbing. It's a sobering reminder of how fragile civilization can be, how dependent we are on systems functioning properly, and how quickly complex societies can unravel when those systems fail. Now, when we talk about the Indo-Aryans moving into this region, we need to be careful about a few things. First, this wasn't a single massive invasion that happened overnight. It was a process that took place over centuries, with different groups arriving at different times, settling in different areas, and interacting with the existing populations in complex ways. Some interactions were probably peaceful, intermarriage, trade, gradual cultural exchange. Others were probably violent, conflicts over territory, resources, or simply because one group saw the other as enemies to be conquered or displaced. The truth is messy and varied, not the simple story of conquest that was sometimes told in the past. Second, the genetic evidence shows significant mixing between the incoming Indo-Aryans and the existing populations of the subcontinent. Modern South Asians carry ancestry from both groups, in varying proportions depending on region and caste. This mixing tells us that the Vedic period wasn't just about one group replacing another. It was about populations coming together and creating something new, even as that process was probably marked by conflict and inequality. The higher castes tend to have more of the Indo-Aryan ancestry, while the lower castes and tribal populations have more of the indigenous ancestry, which tells you something about the social dynamics at play. When you conquer or dominate another group, you typically end up at the top of the social hierarchy, and that pattern gets perpetuated through social institutions like caste that prevent mixing and maintain boundaries. Third, the linguistic evidence is fascinating and complicated. Sanskrit is definitely an Indo-European language, clearly related to Persian, Greek, Latin, and others. But it was spoken in India alongside Dravidian languages in the south and various other language families. Sanskrit absorbed words and features from these other languages, showing real interaction and influence rather than simple replacement. Modern Indo-Aryan languages like Hindi, Bengali, Punjabi and others are descendants of Sanskrit, but they've been shaped by thousands of years of contact with Dravidian and other languages. It's linguistic mixing all the way down, which is exactly what you'd expect in a region where multiple populations with different languages have been living together and interacting for millennia. The religious developments of the Vedic period set the stage for one of the world's most complex religious traditions. Hinduism as it exists today is a synthesis of Vedic religion, indigenous religious practices, philosophical speculation, devotional movements, and countless local traditions all blended together over thousands of years. The Vedas are important, certainly, but they're just one thread in an incredibly complex tapestry. The Vedic sacrifice-centered religion evolved, absorbed influences, responded to critiques, and transformed into something that the original Vedic priests might not even recognize. That's not a criticism. Religions evolve, and the ability to adapt and incorporate new ideas is probably why Hinduism has survived and thrived for so long. Rigid, unchanging systems tend to become brittle and break. Flexible systems that can adapt tend to survive. The philosophical achievements of the late Vedic period and the Upanishads are particularly impressive when you consider that these people were developing these ideas without the benefit of the accumulated philosophical traditions that later thinkers would have access to. They were asking fundamental questions about the nature of reality, consciousness, ethics, and existence largely from scratch, without extensive philosophical predecessors to build on. Sure, they had their own traditions and insights to draw from, but they were genuinely pioneering new philosophical territory. No libraries full of books to reference, no academic institutions, no peer review process, just careful thinking and intense debate passed down through oral tradition. The Upanishadic teachers developed various methods for conveying their insights. One of the most famous is the use of neti, not this, not this. When trying to understand the ultimate reality that underlies all existence, you can't describe it directly because it's beyond description, beyond concepts. So you approach it negatively. It's not this physical object, it's not that mental concept, it's not this experience, it's not that category. By systematically negating everything that Brahman is not, you gradually remove the limitations of conceptual thinking and might, just might, have a direct intuitive insight into what cannot be spoken. It's a clever pedagogical technique, though it must have been frustrating for students. Teacher, what is Brahman? Not this. What about this? Not that either. This? Nope. How about still no? Keep trying. Eventually you either achieve enlightenment or you give up and become a farmer. Both valid life choices, really. The role of the teacher, the guru, became crucial in this tradition. The knowledge wasn't just information that could be transmitted through books or lectures. It required a living relationship between teacher and student, where the student would live with the teacher, serve them, observe them, and gradually absorb not just the words but the understanding behind them. There's an emphasis on the personal transmission of knowledge that couldn't be captured in written texts. Even when the Vedas and Upanishads were eventually written down, the tradition maintained that real understanding required a living teacher. You can read the texts, but without proper guidance, you'll probably misunderstand them. It's like the difference between reading a cookbook and actually learning to cook from an experienced chef. The cookbook has the information, but the chef has the understanding and can teach you things that aren't in the written recipe. The concept Dharma is a notoriously difficult word to translate. It can mean duty, righteousness, law, religion, cosmic order, and more, depending on context. At its most basic, it refers to the proper way of living, the duties and responsibilities appropriate to your position in life. A Brahmin has different dharmic duties than a kshatriya. A student has different duties than a householder. A man has different duties than a woman, according to these texts, which is one of the aspects of the tradition that has aged poorly. Dharma provides a comprehensive framework for how society should be organized and how individuals should behave within that organization. It's simultaneously a description of how things are and a prescription for how things should be, which is convenient if you're defending the status quo but problematic if you're trying to reform it. The tension between worldly life and renunciation became a major theme. On one hand, you have the householder life, getting married, having children, pursuing wealth and success, fulfilling your social duties, performing rituals. This was the path for most people, and it was considered legitimate and valuable. On the other hand, you have the renunciant path, giving up worldly attachments leaving society focusing entirely on spiritual practice and the pursuit of liberation. Some texts praise both paths, others suggest that renunciation is ultimately superior. This tension has never been fully resolved in Indian religious traditions. How do you balance spiritual goals with the practical necessities of life? Is it better to be in the world trying to fulfill your duties, or to leave the world in search of ultimate truth? Different teachers gave different answers, and individuals had to figure out what worked for them. Most people chose the householder path because, food is nice and dying alone in a forest isn't appealing to everyone. But the ideal of renunciation remained powerfully attractive, and it would shape Indian religious culture profoundly. The Vedic period also saw the development of increasingly sophisticated ideas about time. The concept of yugas, vast cosmic ages, emerged. The world goes through cycles of creation and destruction spanning millions or billions of years. Human history is placed within this vast cosmic time frame, which makes our individual lives and concerns seem pretty insignificant in comparison. It's either a depressing cosmology, we're in the worst age and things won't get better for a long time, or a liberating one. Nothing in this world is permanent, so don't get too attached to how things are right now. Probably depends on your personality and circumstances which interpretation you find more appealing. The idea was that rituals maintained cosmic order, kept the gods happy, and ensured prosperity and success. The largest and most elaborate rituals could take months to complete, required multiple priests with specialized knowledge, and cost enormous amounts of wealth. Only kings and the very wealthy could afford these grand rituals, which conveniently reinforced the social hierarchy while claiming to benefit everyone. The gods probably got bored of watching the same rituals performed with obsessive attention to detail, but hey, job security for the priests. You can't exactly automate ritual sacrifice, so the Brahmins had a pretty solid economic niche carved out for themselves. Their monopoly on sacred knowledge and ritual expertise gave them significant social power, even in cases where temporal political power rested with the warrior class. When you control access to the divine and claim that the prosperity of the entire society depends on rituals being performed correctly, people tend to listen to you and pay you well for your services. The astronomical knowledge developed during the Vedic period was also impressive. Accurate ritual performance required knowing the right times for different ceremonies, which meant understanding the movements of the sun, moon, stars, and planets. Vedic texts contain sophisticated astronomical observations and calculations. They developed lunar and solar calendars, identified constellations, tracked planetary movements, and understood celestial cycles. This wasn't just practical knowledge for scheduling rituals, it reflects a genuine scientific curiosity about the cosmos and how it works. The later Vedanga texts that supplement the Vedas include extensive astronomical material. Some of the calculations they made were remarkably accurate. They didn't have telescopes or modern instruments, just careful observation over many generations, mathematical ability, and the willingness to look up at the sky night after night and try to make sense of the patterns they saw. It's humbling, really, what humans can figure out armed only with their eyes, their minds, and sufficient patience. As the Buddhism and Jainism would both reject significant aspects of the Vedic tradition: the authority of the Vedas themselves, the importance of ritual sacrifice, the legitimacy of the caste system, while retaining other elements like karma and reincarnation. These new religions would offer alternative paths to liberation, accessible to people regardless of their caste or social position. They would challenge Brahminical authority and offer critiques of the increasingly complex and expensive ritual tradition. But they wouldn't have had anything to react against if the Vedic tradition hadn't first established itself so thoroughly. Sometimes the most important contribution a tradition makes is creating the conditions for its own critique and transformation. The Vedic period gave India and the world not just a religious and philosophical tradition, but also the seeds of its own questioning and evolution. Not many traditions can say they were intellectually vigorous enough to produce their own most effective critics. That's actually a sign of health, not weakness. It means people were really thinking, really questioning, really trying to get at truth rather than just mindlessly repeating what they'd been told. The Vedic sages wanted to understand reality and find liberation, and they were willing to follow that inquiry wherever it led, even if it meant challenging their own assumptions. That intellectual courage and honesty is perhaps their greatest legacy, even more than any specific doctrine or practice they established. By around 600 BCE, the Vedic period was giving way to something new, and the Indian subcontinent was about to enter one of the most intellectually fertile and politically transformative periods in its history. The simple tribal structures of the early Vedic age had evolved into something considerably more complex. 16 major kingdoms and republics known collectively as the Mahajanapadas, or Great Realms. These weren't tiny chiefdoms squabbling over cattle anymore. We're talking about substantial political entities with defined territories, urban centres, armies, treasuries, and bureaucracies. The subcontinent was becoming crowded with competing powers, each trying to expand its influence while avoiding being absorbed by its neighbours. It's like a massive multiplayer strategy game, except the stakes were actual lives and territories rather than virtual points, and there was no reset button when things went badly. The 16 Mahajanapadas were scattered across northern India, from modern-day Afghanistan in the northwest to Bengal in the east. Some of the more important ones included Magadha in the east, which would eventually dominate all the others, Kosala, famous as the kingdom where the Buddha spent much of his teaching career, Vatsa, with its capital at Kausambi, Avanti in the west, and Gandhara in the northwest, which would later become a crucial crossroads between Indian and Greek cultures. These kingdoms varied in their political organisation. Some were monarchies ruled by kings with varying degrees of absolute power. Others were republics or oligarchies, governed by assemblies of elders or councils of leading families. Decisions were made collectively, positions rotated among qualified individuals, and there were procedures for debate and voting. Not exactly one person, one-vote democracy in the modern sense, but still a significant departure from one guy on a throne making all the decisions. The economic base supporting these kingdoms was primarily agricultural, as it had been for centuries, but with significant developments. Iron tools were now in widespread use, making agriculture more productive. You could clear forests more easily, plough fields more efficiently, and generally get more food out of the same amount of land. Iron weapons also meant that warfare was changing, becoming more organised and more deadly. A Bronze Age army and an Iron Age army meeting on the battlefield is not a fair fight, which several Bronze Age holdouts discovered the hard way. The increased agricultural productivity supported larger populations, which meant bigger armies, more complex administration, and more surplus wealth for kings to tax and use for their various projects. Urban centres were growing, trade was expanding, and a money economy was developing to supplement the older barter system. Though imagine being the person who had to decide exchange rates. Let's see, 1 cow equals 40 chickens or 2 bolts of cloth, or it's enough to give you a headache. The old Vedic certainties were being questioned. The Brahminical establishment, with its elaborate rituals and claims of spiritual authority, was facing criticism from multiple directions. People were asking uncomfortable questions. Why should the Brahmins have a monopoly on spiritual knowledge? Why are these expensive rituals necessary? What if there are other paths to spiritual liberation? Is the caste system really divinely ordained, or is it just a convenient way for some people to maintain power over others? These weren't just philosophical abstractions, they had real social and political implications. If anyone could achieve enlightenment through their own effort, regardless of their birth caste, that undermined the entire social hierarchy. If elaborate rituals weren't necessary for spiritual progress, the Brahmins lost their primary justification for their privileged position. Unsurprisingly, the Brahminical establishment wasn't thrilled about these ideas, but they couldn't simply suppress them through force, because many of the questioners had powerful supporters, including kings who were interested in philosophies that didn't automatically place priests above warriors in the social hierarchy. Into this bubbling cauldron of political competition and spiritual seeking came 2 figures who would fundamentally reshape not just Indian religion, but world religion: Siddhartha Gautama, who would become the Buddha, and Mahavira, the founder of Jainism as an organized religion. Both were contemporaries in the 6th century BCE. Both came from the Kshatriya warrior class. Both rejected the Vedic religious establishment, and both proposed alternative paths to liberation that didn't require Brahmin priests or expensive sacrifices. Beyond those similarities, however, they developed quite different philosophies and practices. Let's start with Siddhartha Gautama, because his story has become one of the most famous spiritual biographies in human history, told and retold across cultures and centuries until the historical person is almost obscured by layers of legend and interpretation. The basic outline, stripped of later embellishments, is this. Siddhartha was born into a royal or noble family in what's now Nepal sometime around 563 BCE, though the exact dates are debated. His father was either a king or an important chieftain, depending on which sources you trust. According to tradition, his father was told by fortune tellers that his son would either become a great king or a great spiritual teacher, and being a practical man who wanted his son to inherit his position, he decided to make sure the boy never encountered anything that might trigger spiritual seeking. So Siddhartha was raised in luxury, sheltered from any exposure to suffering, disease, old age, or death. He was given everything he could want, married to a beautiful woman, had a son, and by all accounts should have been perfectly content. Except, of course, humans don't work that way. You can't actually protect someone from awareness of suffering by building really nice walls around them. Eventually, according to the traditional story, Siddhartha ventured outside the palace and encountered what are called the four sights: an old person, a sick person, a corpse, and a wandering ascetic. These encounters shattered his sheltered worldview and made him realize that suffering was an inescapable part of human existence. No amount of wealth or pleasure could prevent aging, sickness, and death. But the sight of the ascetic suggested that maybe there was a way to find peace with these realities, to understand suffering and transcend it. So Siddhartha did what any rational person in the grip of an existential crisis would do. He abandoned his wife and child in the middle of the night, left his comfortable life behind, and went off to find enlightenment. Not exactly the most responsible choice from a family obligations perspective, but then again, if he'd stayed home, we wouldn't be talking about him 26 centuries later, so maybe his priorities were sound from a historical legacy standpoint, if not from a parenting standpoint. Siddhartha spent years studying with various teachers, learning meditation techniques and philosophical systems. He practiced extreme asceticism, fasting to the point of near death, pushing his body to its limits to try to achieve spiritual breakthrough through sheer willpower and self-mortification. After several years of this, he apparently decided that starving yourself until you look like a skeleton isn't actually conducive to clear thinking or spiritual insight. It's hard, so he abandoned extreme asceticism, started eating again, and looked for a middle way between self-indulgence and self-torture. He sat down under a fig tree, which would later be called the Bodhi tree, and resolved not to get up until he had figured out the fundamental nature of existence and the solution to suffering. According to tradition, he sat there for 49 days, going deeper and deeper into meditation, confronting various temptations and distractions, personified in the stories as Mara, a demon or spiritual adversary, until finally he achieved enlightenment. He became the Buddha, the awakened one, someone who had seen through the illusions of normal consciousness and understood reality as it truly is. What exactly did he realize? Buddhism is complex and has many schools with different interpretations, but the core of the Buddha's teaching can be summarized in what are called the Four Noble Truths. First, life is characterized by suffering or unsatisfactoriness. This isn't just bad things happen sometimes. It's a more profound observation that even pleasant experiences are ultimately unsatisfying because they're impermanent. You enjoy something, it ends, you want more, you can't have it, you suffer. Second, suffering has a cause, which is craving or attachment. We suffer because we're constantly grasping for things we don't have, trying to hold on to things that are changing, and rejecting things we can't avoid. We want reality to be different than it is, and this constant struggle against what is creates suffering. Third, suffering can end. There is a state of liberation called nirvana, where craving ceases and suffering ends. And fourth, there's a path to achieve this liberation, the Noble Eightfold Path, which consists of right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right meditation. Follow this path, eliminate craving, and you can escape suffering and achieve nirvana. This teaching was revolutionary in several ways. First, it didn't require belief in gods or performance of rituals. The Buddha wasn't particularly interested in theological questions. When people asked him about the nature of the universe, whether the self was eternal, what happened after death to enlightened beings, he would often refuse to answer, saying these questions weren't useful for the practical goal of ending suffering. This pragmatic focus on what works rather than metaphysical speculation was quite different from Brahminical philosophy. Second, the path was open to anyone regardless of caste. Women could follow it, though the early Buddhist community was ambivalent about this and created more restrictions for nuns than for monks. Poor people could follow it. Outcasts could follow it. Your birth didn't determine your spiritual potential, your effort and understanding did. This was radically egalitarian for the time, and it's no surprise that Buddhism attracted many followers from outside the Brahmin caste. Third, the Buddha rejected the authority of the Vedas. He claimed it came from direct personal insight achieved through meditation. Anyone could, at least in theory, verify his claims by following the path themselves and achieving the same realization. This empirical, experiential approach to religious truth was quite modern in its sensibility. Don't just believe what you're told. Test it, practice it, see if it actually works for you. Of course, the path to enlightenment was supposed to take many lifetimes of dedicated effort for most people, so verifying the claims might take a while, but still, the principle was there. Question authority, including Buddhist authority. There's a famous quote attributed to the Buddha, "Be a lamp unto yourself." Don't blindly follow teachers or traditions. Figure out truth through your own investigation and experience. It's good advice, though it does make maintaining a coherent religious tradition somewhat challenging when your founder basically told everyone to think for themselves. The Buddha spent the remaining 45 years of his life teaching, wandering from place to place with a growing community of monks and nuns, giving talks, debating with other teachers, and trying to help people understand the path to liberation. He wasn't the kind of religious founder who established a political empire or even a highly organized church during his lifetime. He was more like a wandering teacher with a message, and that message spread organically as people heard it, understood it, and decided to follow it. By the time he died around 483 BCE, dates are approximate and disputed, he had established a monastic community, the Sangha, and had many lay followers. But Buddhism was still just one movement among many in the crowded religious marketplace of the Mahajanapadas period. Now Mahavira and Jainism. Mahavira was born around 599 BCE, making him an older contemporary of the Buddha, though the exact relationship between them is unclear. Like the Buddha, he came from a Kshatriya family, rejected worldly life, practiced extreme asceticism, and achieved spiritual enlightenment. Unlike the Buddha, Mahavira didn't reject extreme asceticism. In fact, Jainism makes asceticism central to its practice. Mahavira is said to have practiced such severe austerities that he gave up even clothing for much of his life, wandering naked as a statement of complete renunciation of worldly concerns. The Jain monks of the Digambara sect still practice sky-clad, naked monasticism, though this is obviously challenging in climates that aren't tropical and in societies with strong norms about clothing. Their idea of giving up material possessions was quite literal. Even cloth was too much attachment to material things. This makes Buddhist monasticism, where you at least get to wear robes, look positively indulgent by comparison. The core principle of Jainism is ahimsa, non-violence toward all living beings. This isn't just don't murder people, which is a pretty low bar that most religions clear. Jain ahimsa extends to all life forms, down to insects and microscopic organisms. Orthodox Jain monks carry brooms to sweep the path in front of them so they don't step on insects. They wear masks over their mouths to avoid accidentally inhaling small creatures. They strain their water before drinking to remove any organisms. They're vegetarian, obviously, and avoid root vegetables because harvesting them kills the entire plant rather than just taking fruit or leaves. This level of attention to non-violence is admirable in its consistency, though it does make daily life rather complicated. Imagine planning your travel routes based on minimizing insect casualties, or spending 10 minutes filtering your morning beverage to make sure you're not committing involuntary genocide against microorganisms. It's the kind of ethical commitment that makes you question whether your own efforts at being a good person are actually serious or just casual weekend hobbies. Jainism also developed a sophisticated philosophy of perspective and truth called Anekantavada, the doctrine of many-sidedness. The idea is that reality is complex and multifaceted, and any single perspective or statement can only capture part of the truth. Different people, from different positions, with different levels of knowledge, will perceive things differently, and all these perspectives might have validity. This leads to a kind of philosophical pluralism and tolerance that's quite sophisticated. You can't simply declare that you have the absolute truth and everyone else is wrong, because you're only seeing reality from your limited perspective. It's a remarkably humble epistemological position for a religion to take, especially compared to traditions that claim absolute certainty about everything. Of course, it also makes it harder to make definitive statements about anything, which can be frustrating when you're trying to teach people. Is this true? Well, from certain perspectives, considering particular definitions, acknowledging the limitations of language. Just give me a yes or no answer, please. Jain philosophers. It's not that simple. It never is, apparently. Both Buddhism and Jainism accepted the concepts of karma and reincarnation from the broader Indian religious milieu, but they reinterpreted these concepts in their own ways. For the Jains, karma is almost physical. It's a kind of subtle matter that sticks to the soul as a result of actions, especially violent actions or passionate attachments. Liberation, called Kevala in Jainism, requires removing this karmic matter through ascetic practices, right conduct, and eventually achieving a state of perfect knowledge and detachment. For Buddhists, the whole concept of a permanent soul is rejected. What we think of as the self is actually just a collection of constantly changing physical and mental processes. Karma isn't something that happens to a soul, it's the causal process by which our actions condition future experiences. Liberation is the cessation of this entire process, the complete ending of craving and becoming. Both systems are trying to solve the same problem, the suffering inherent in existence, but they have different analyses of what's causing the problem and different methods for solving it. The political landscape of the Mahajanapadas period was dominated by constant warfare and diplomatic maneuvering, as the various kingdoms tried to gain advantage over their neighbours. This wasn't the occasionally skirmish over cattle raids of the early Vedic period. This was systematic, organised warfare with professional armies, sophisticated tactics, and real existential stakes. If you lost badly enough, your kingdom ceased to exist, absorbed into a larger neighbour's territory. The kingdom of Magadha, centred around what's now Bihar in northeastern India, gradually emerged as the most powerful player in this interstate competition. A series of capable and often ruthless kings expanded Magadha's territory, defeated rival kingdoms, and built up administrative and military capabilities that would eventually allow Magadha to dominate the entire region. The Buddha and Mahavira were both active during this period of political upheaval, and they interacted with various kings and political figures. Kings were interested in these new religious movements partly for genuine spiritual reasons, but also because alternative religions that didn't automatically place Brahmins above everyone else were politically useful. If you're a king trying to centralize power, having an independent source of religious authority that doesn't answer to the Brahminical establishment is valuable. Both Buddhism and Jainism received royal patronage from various rulers, which helped them grow and establish themselves. Religion and politics were intimately intertwined, as they always are no matter how much we might pretend otherwise. Kings supported religions that legitimized their rule. Religions grew with royal support, and everyone benefited except the people who had to fight in the wars, but their opinions weren't being solicited anyway. This period also saw tremendous intellectual ferment beyond just Buddhism and Jainism. There were numerous other religious and philosophical schools, teachers propounding various doctrines, debating each other publicly, trying to attract followers. There were materialists who rejected religion entirely, arguing that only the physical world existed and that death was the end. You should therefore enjoy life while you can rather than wasting it on spiritual pursuits. There were skeptics who argued that certain knowledge was impossible, and that we should suspend judgment on metaphysical questions. It was like a philosophical marketplace, with competing vendors all trying to convince you their product was the best. Imagine a debate where if you lose, all your students might leave you for the winner. The stakes were high, and the quality of argument had to be sharp. You couldn't just rely on tradition or authority. You had to actually make convincing cases for your positions. This intellectual environment, competitive and critical, was incredibly productive. Ideas were tested against each other, refined through debate, and the ones that couldn't withstand scrutiny were discarded. It's one of the reasons this period was so philosophically fertile. There was genuine competition in the marketplace of ideas, and new schools had to offer something compelling to attract followers. Buddhism succeeded partly because it offered a clear path, practical techniques, and a message that resonated with people's experiences. Jainism succeeded because its ethical rigor and philosophical sophistication attracted certain types of seekers. The Brahminical tradition responded to these challenges by developing its own philosophical schools, refining its arguments, and incorporating some ideas from its competitors. The competition made everyone sharper. When you can't take your position for granted, when you have to defend it against smart critics, you either develop better arguments or you lose ground. It's Darwin's natural selection applied to ideas. By the end of the Mahajanapadas period, Magadha had emerged as clearly the dominant power in northern India, having absorbed or subordinated most of the other kingdoms. The stage was set for the next major development, the creation of India's first true empire, the Mauryan Empire, which would unite the entire subcontinent under a single rule for the first time in history. But before we get to that, we need to talk about an unexpected visitor from the west, Alexander the Great. In 326 BCE, Alexander and his Macedonian army came crashing into the northwestern edge of the Indian subcontinent after having conquered basically everything from Greece to Persia. Alexander had heard that India was wealthy and full of wonders, and being Alexander, he decided he needed to conquer it too. He crossed the Indus River and defeated some local rulers, including King Porus, though Porus apparently impressed Alexander enough with his bravery that Alexander let him continue ruling as a vassal. But here's the thing, Alexander's army was exhausted. They'd been campaigning for years, they were thousands of miles from home, and they'd heard rumours about even larger Indian armies waiting further east. So Alexander, faced with an army that wouldn't fight anymore, turned around and began the long journey back west. He would die in Babylon in 323 BCE, never having conquered India, and his empire would immediately fracture into competing kingdoms. Alexander's invasion had two important effects on Indian history. First, it temporarily disrupted the political situation in the northwest, weakening the kingdoms there and creating a power vacuum. Second, it established direct Greek-Indian contact, which would lead to fascinating cultural exchange, particularly in the Gandhara region, where Greek and Indian artistic styles would blend to create distinctive Greco-Buddhist art. But enter Chandragupta Maurya, the founder of the Mauryan Empire. He may have been from a low-caste background, possibly even from the Shudra caste, though later sources tried to give him more respectable origins. Together, Chandragupta and Chanakya overthrew the existing Nanda dynasty that ruled Magadha. How exactly they accomplished this varies by source, but it probably involved a combination of military force, strategic alliances, and political maneuvering. By around 322 BCE, Chandragupta controlled Magadha, the most powerful kingdom in northern India. But Chandragupta didn't stop there. He even fought against Seleucus, one of Alexander's successors who controlled the eastern portion of Alexander's former empire. The war between Chandragupta and Seleucus ended in a peace treaty around 305 BCE, with Chandragupta gaining extensive territories in what's now Afghanistan and Pakistan, and Seleucus receiving 500 war elephants, which tells you something about the military value of elephants in this era. Imagine being in a diplomatic negotiation. I'll give you these provinces if you give me 500 elephants. Deal. Just logistically transporting 500 elephants from India to the Middle East must have been an adventure in itself. The food requirements alone would be staggering. But elephants were the tanks of the ancient world, intimidating, powerful, and effective in battle if properly trained and deployed. By the end of his reign, Chandragupta had created an empire that stretched from Bengal in the east to Afghanistan in the northwest, controlling most of the Indian subcontinent north of the Deccan Plateau. This was unprecedented. No one had ever unified such a vast portion of the subcontinent under a single rule before. The Mauryan Empire wasn't just large, it was also relatively well administered, at least for an ancient empire. Chanakya's text on statecraft, the Arthashastra, gives us insight into Mauryan political thinking. It's a remarkably cynical and pragmatic work, basically an ancient Indian version of Machiavelli's The Prince. The Arthashastra discusses everything from how to manage the economy, maintain the army, conduct espionage, suppress rebellions, collect taxes, and generally run an empire efficiently. Morality. The goal is to acquire and maintain power, and pretty much any method is acceptable if it serves that goal. It's the kind of text that makes you grateful you're not living under an ancient autocrat who's taken its lessons to heart. Should I raise taxes or use secret agents to intimidate my opponents? Why not both? The Arthashastra would suggest helpfully. Chandragupta ruled for about 24 years, and then, according to tradition, he did something unusual. He abdicated and became a Jain monk, eventually dying by voluntarily fasting to death in the Jain manner. If this tradition is true, it's quite a reversal. Going from emperor commanding millions to an ascetic voluntarily starving himself to death. It suggests that despite building a vast empire through force and statecraft, Chandragupta was genuinely concerned with spiritual matters and took the Jain path seriously enough to follow it to its ultimate conclusion. Or maybe he was just tired of being emperor and decided to try something completely different for his final years. Either way, it's an unusual ending for a great conqueror. Chandragupta was succeeded by his son Bindusara, who continued the expansion of the empire, conquering much of the Deccan Plateau in southern India. But Bindusara is relatively obscure compared to his son, who would become the most famous Mauryan emperor and one of the most significant figures in Indian history, Ashoka the Great. For the first part of his reign, Ashoka was a typical ancient emperor, ambitious, militaristic, concerned with expanding and consolidating his empire. His most significant military campaign was the conquest of Kalinga, a kingdom on the east coast of India that had maintained its independence. The war was brutal. According to Ashoka's own later inscriptions, over 100,000 people were killed, and many more were displaced or died from the aftermath of war. Even accounting for possible exaggeration, it was clearly a devastating conflict. And then something remarkable happened. Ashoka, surveying the carnage his conquest had caused, was overcome with remorse. In his own, he declared that he would no longer seek conquest through violence, but would instead pursue conquest through dharma, through righteousness and moral law. He converted to Buddhism and spent the rest of his reign trying to rule according to Buddhist principles. This is not typical behavior for ancient emperors. Usually they conquer, celebrate, and then move on to conquering more. They don't publicly express remorse and completely change their governing philosophy. But Ashoka wasn't a typical emperor. Ashoka's edicts, carved on rocks and pillars and distributed across his vast empire, are among the most valuable historical sources we have for ancient India. They're written in Prakrit, the common languages people actually spoke, rather than in Sanskrit, the elite literary language. This choice itself is significant. Ashoka wanted to communicate with his subjects, not just with the educated elite. The edicts discuss Ashoka's policies, his moral vision, and his understanding of proper governance. He promoted ahimsa, non-violence toward all living beings. He established hospitals for both humans and animals. He had trees planted and wells dug along roads for the benefit of travellers. He sent diplomatic missions to neighbouring kingdoms promoting Buddhist teachings. He encouraged tolerance between different religious groups, stating that all sects should be respected and that sectarian conflict was to be avoided. He appointed officials called Dharma Mahamatras, whose job was to ensure just governance and to report on public welfare. Reading Ashoka's edicts, you get the sense of someone genuinely trying to rule ethically, to balance the practical demands of governing an empire with moral principles that emphasized compassion and non-violence. Was he completely successful? Probably not. Running an empire requires making hard choices, and sometimes compassion and statecraft are in tension. But the attempt itself was remarkable. Ashoka was essentially trying to create a government based on Buddhist values, to prove that you could rule effectively while adhering to moral principles. It's an experiment that would have interested political philosophers greatly if Ashoka hadn't been largely forgotten after the collapse of the Mauryan Empire, only to be rediscovered in the modern era when scholars learned to read his inscriptions. Ashoka's support for Buddhism was crucial to the religion's spread. He sent missionaries throughout his empire and beyond, including to Sri Lanka, where Buddhism took root so thoroughly that Sri Lanka became and remains a predominantly Buddhist country. He sent missions to Greek kingdoms in the West, though we don't know how successful those were. Buddhism didn't take off in the Mediterranean the way it did in Asia. He held Buddhist councils to settle doctrinal disputes and allegedly supported the preservation and dissemination of Buddhist texts. Without Ashoka, Buddhism might have remained a relatively minor Indian sect. With his support, it became a world religion that would eventually spread across Asia to become one of the most influential religious and philosophical traditions in human history. The Mauryan Empire under Ashoka represented the first time the Indian subcontinent was substantially unified under a single government. It wasn't complete. The southern tip of India remained independent, but most of the subcontinent was part of this one political system. The empire had a complex administrative structure with officials at various levels managing different aspects of governance. There was a substantial standing army, probably the largest in the world at the time. There was extensive road building and infrastructure development. Trade flourished, both within the empire and with regions beyond its borders. Cities grew. Arts and architecture flourished. The Mauryan court supported scholars, poets, and artists. It was in many ways a golden age for the regions under Mauryan control. But empires, as we've seen repeatedly throughout history, don't last forever. After Ashoka's death around 232 BCE, the Mauryan Empire began to decline. His successors were less capable, the empire began to fragment, and within about 50 years of Ashoka's death, the Mauryan Empire had collapsed entirely. The last Mauryan emperor was assassinated by one of his generals, who founded a new dynasty that controlled a much smaller territory. Northern India fragmented again into competing kingdoms, and the political unity that the Mauryas had achieved was lost. It would be many centuries before another empire would manage to unite as much of the subcontinent under a single rule. Why did the Mauryan Empire collapse so quickly after Ashoka? Historians debate this. Some argue that Ashoka's pacifism weakened the empire militarily, making it vulnerable to external threats and internal rebellion. Others point out that the empire was probably overextended, that maintaining control over such a vast territory with ancient communication and transportation technology was inherently unstable. Provincial governors might have become increasingly independent, developing their own power bases and eventually breaking away. Economic factors might have played a role. Maintaining a large army and bureaucracy is expensive, and if tax revenues declined or trade was disrupted, the imperial system could become unsustainable. Or it might have simply been bad luck and less capable successors. Ashoka was clearly an exceptional ruler. His successors were apparently not. When you have an empire that depends heavily on the competence of the person at the top, and that person is replaced by someone less competent, things can fall apart quickly. Whatever the specific causes, the collapse of the Mauryan Empire ended the first great experiment in Indian political unity. But the legacy of the empire, and particularly of Ashoka, endured. Ashoka's symbol of 4 lions standing back to back, which topped one of his pillars, is now the national emblem of India. His Dharma Chakra, the Wheel of Dharma, is in the centre of the Indian flag. Ashoka is remembered and honoured in modern India as a model of ethical governance, even though the actual details of his reign were forgotten for centuries, and only recovered through modern archaeology and the decipherment of his inscriptions. It's a reminder that sometimes historical legacies work in unexpected ways. Ashoka's edicts were carved in stone to last forever, but then they were forgotten and unread for over 1,000 years, until scholars figured out how to read ancient scripts and pieced together who this emperor who spoke so eloquently about non-violence and moral governance actually was. The period politically, it saw the evolution from small kingdoms to a subcontinent-spanning empire. Religiously and philosophically, it saw the emergence of Buddhism and Jainism as alternatives to Vedic religion, the flowering of philosophical debate and speculation, and the beginning of Buddhism's transformation from Indian sect to world religion. Socially, it saw the continued development and rigidification of the caste system, alongside challenges to that system from alternative religious movements. Economically, it saw increasing trade, urbanization, and the development of more sophisticated administrative and economic systems. Technologically, it saw the full adoption of iron tools and weapons, transforming both agriculture and warfare. It's also a period that demonstrates some recurring patterns in history. New religious and philosophical movements tend to emerge during times of social and political change, when old certainties are being questioned and people are looking for new answers. Empires tend to expand rapidly under capable rulers and collapse quickly under weak ones. Political unity is hard to maintain over large territories with ancient technology. Ethical principles and pragmatic governance are in constant tension, and even leaders with the best intentions struggle to balance the two. Ideas can have impacts far beyond what their originators anticipated, spreading across cultures and continents in unpredictable ways. And historical memory is selective and sometimes forgotten entirely, only to be recovered centuries or millennia later by archaeologists and scholars piecing together fragments of evidence. The Mahajanapadas and Mauryan periods set patterns that would recur throughout Indian history. Cycles of fragmentation and unity, the interplay between political power and religious authority, the tension between tradition and reform, the constant cultural exchange between different regions and peoples, and the remarkable intellectual and spiritual creativity that would make India one of the world's great civilizations. The specific kingdoms would change, the dynasties would rise and fall, but these underlying patterns would persist, shaping the subcontinent's development for the next 2,000 years and beyond. Not bad for a few centuries of ancient history in a place that most of the world barely knew existed. While Greeks were philosophizing and Romans were conquering, Indians were building empires, founding religions and asking profound questions about the nature of existence. They weren't waiting for someone else to bring them civilization, they were creating their own, thank you very much. And it was every bit as sophisticated and influential as anything happening anywhere else in the ancient world. Maybe more so, given that 2 of the world's major religions emerged from this period, and 1 billion people today still follow the philosophical traditions that were being developed in these kingdoms and empires so long ago. That's impact that lasts. Let's delve deeper into what daily life might have looked like during this transformative period, because all these grand political and religious developments were happening against the backdrop of actual people going about their ordinary business, most of whom probably weren't spending much time contemplating the Four Noble Truths or the nature of ultimate reality. They were farming, trading, raising families, and trying to get by, much like people everywhere and always. The cities of this period, places like Pataliputra, the Mauryan capital, Varanasi, Taxila and others, were substantial urban centres by ancient standards. Pataliputra, at its height, may have had a population of several 100,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at the time. Not Rome. The Greek ambassador Megasthenes, who visited the Mauryan court during Chandragupta's reign, left descriptions of Pataliputra that, while second-hand since his original text is lost, suggest a well-organized and prosperous city. The royal palace was apparently quite luxurious, decorated with gold and silver, though we should probably take Greek descriptions of Eastern luxury with a grain of salt since they tended toward exaggeration. Greeks loved to portray Eastern courts as decadent and over the top, whether they actually were or not. Still, the Mauryan capital was clearly a significant urban centre with substantial resources devoted to both defensive structures and impressive architecture. You don't build massive city walls for fun. They're expensive and labour-intensive, so their existence tells us the city was considered worth protecting at significant cost. The economy of the Mauryan period was complex and monetised. Coins were in circulation, facilitating trade and taxation. The Arthashastra goes into considerable detail about economic policy, discussing everything from agriculture and animal husbandry to mining, manufacturing and trade. The state was actively involved in economic management, operating mines, controlling certain industries, regulating markets, and collecting substantial taxes. Tax rates mentioned in the Arthashastra are often quite high, sometimes up to 1/3 or 1/2 of agricultural production, which would be considered heavy taxation by any standard. Of course, the Arthashastra might be describing an ideal rather than reality. An actual tax collection was probably less efficient than the text suggests. Evading taxes is a human universal, and ancient farmers were probably just as creative as modern tax avoiders at hiding their actual production from tax collectors. How much grain did you harvest? Oh, terrible year, barely enough to feed the family. Meanwhile, there's a substantial surplus hidden somewhere that the tax collector won't find. Trade during this period was extensive, both within the empire and beyond its borders. Indian textiles, spices, gems, and other luxury goods were exported to the Mediterranean world, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. In return, India imported horses from Central Asia. Indian horses apparently weren't as good as Central Asian breeds for military purposes, exotic goods from various regions, and most importantly, gold and silver, since India's demand for precious metals exceeded its domestic supply. The trade routes were long and dangerous, crossing mountains, deserts, and seas, but the profit margins on luxury goods made the risks worthwhile. A merchant who successfully completed a trading expedition to a distant land could make a fortune. A merchant who didn't, through shipwreck, banditry, disease, or simple bad luck, lost everything. It wasn't a business for the risk-averse, which is probably why merchants were generally respected but not placed at the top of the social hierarchy. Trading is useful, but from the perspective of the warrior and priestly classes, it's also a bit vulgar, too concerned with profit rather than glory or spiritual truth. The merchants probably didn't care much about this attitude as long as they were allowed to continue making money. The craft guilds of this period were significant economic and social organizations. Artisans of various types, weavers, metalworkers, potters, carpenters, and many others, organized into guilds that regulated training, maintained quality standards, negotiated with rulers, and essentially functioned as both trade unions and professional associations. These guilds could become quite powerful, sometimes playing political roles and occasionally even providing military forces in times of need. The guild system gave craftspeople some collective bargaining power and protection that they wouldn't have had as isolated individuals. It also transmitted skills across generations through apprenticeship systems, ensuring that technical knowledge wasn't lost. When you joined a guild, you were joining a community that would, at least in theory, support you through difficult times and vouch for the quality of your work. In return, you had to follow guild rules, maintain standards, and contribute to collective obligations. It's the agriculture. Most people were farmers, working fields that they might own, rent, or work as labourers depending on their social and economic position. The primary crops were wheat and barley in the north, rice in areas with sufficient water, various pulses and vegetables, and fruits where climate allowed. Agricultural technology was improving. Iron ploughs were more efficient than earlier tools, irrigation systems were expanding, and agricultural knowledge was accumulating. But farming was still backbreaking labour, entirely dependent on human and animal power, vulnerable to weather, pests and disease, and requiring most of the family's time and energy for much of the year. You couldn't just plant seeds and wait for harvest. You had to prepare fields, sow at the right time, weed constantly, protect crops from animals and pests, irrigate or pray for rain, and then harvest and process everything before it's spoiled. Then you had to save enough seed for next year, set aside enough food for your family, pay your taxes, pay any rent or debts, and hope that what remained was sufficient to get you through to the next harvest. One bad year, and you could be in desperate straits. 2 or 3 bad years in succession, and famine could result. Farming wasn't romantic or pastoral. It was hard, risky work with little margin for error. The role of Buddhism in Mauryan society, particularly under Ashoka, deserves more attention. Ashoka's embrace of Buddhism wasn't just personal piety, it had significant political and social implications. By promoting Buddhism, Ashoka was promoting a religious system that emphasized moral behavior, non-violence, and compassion, which aligned with his vision of righteous governance. Buddhist monks and monasteries received royal patronage, which helped Buddhism expand and develop institutional structures. Monasteries became centers of learning, preserving texts, teaching students, and providing various social services. The Buddhist emphasis on reducing suffering and practicing compassion probably influenced Mauryan policies regarding public welfare. The hospitals, wells, and rest houses that Ashoka mentions in his edicts reflect Buddhist values being translated into government programs. However, we should be careful not to idealize Ashoka's Buddhist government too much. Even as he promoted non-violence and compassion, he still maintained a large military, still collected taxes by force if necessary, still punished criminals, and still had to make the hard choices that governing requires. You can't run an empire entirely on compassion. At some point, practical considerations intrude. The edicts themselves sometimes hint at this tension. Ashoka talks about treating forest tribes kindly, but also warns them to behave properly or face punishment. He promotes religious tolerance, but also suggests that divisive sectarian behavior should be controlled. He's trying to balance ideals with reality, and the result is a government that was probably more humane than most ancient empires, but still an empire, with all the violence and coercion that maintaining imperial rule requires. It's easy to be cynical about this gap between ideals and practice, but it's also worth recognizing that even partially applying ethical principles in governance is better than not trying at all. The spread of Buddhism beyond India's borders, which accelerated under Ashoka's patronage, would have profound long-term consequences. Buddhism would become the dominant religion in much of East and Southeast Asia, shaping the cultures of Tibet, China, Korea, Japan, Thailand, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and many other regions. The Buddhist missionary impulse, the idea that the teaching should be shared widely rather than kept as a secret doctrine for the initiated, was crucial to this spread. Buddhism was also relatively flexible in adapting to local cultures, incorporating local deities and practices into its framework rather than demanding complete rejection of existing traditions. This adaptability, combined with active missionary work and often royal patronage in various kingdoms, allowed Buddhism to spread in a way that more rigid or exclusive religious systems might not have managed. Ironically, Buddhism would eventually decline in India itself, the land of its origin, largely absorbed back into the Hindu mainstream or displaced by other movements. But Jainism took a different path. It never spread beyond India the way Buddhism did, remaining primarily an Indian religion. But within India, Jainism maintained itself as a distinct tradition, particularly strong in certain regions and among merchant communities who appreciated the Jain emphasis on non-violence, honest dealing, and ascetic discipline. Jain monks and nuns continued to practice their rigorous asceticism, and Jain laypeople continued to support them while trying to follow Jain ethics in their own lives as best they could, while still participating in normal economic and social activity. The Jain community was never huge, but it was stable, well-organized, and contributed significantly to Indian philosophy, literature, and art. The fact that Jainism has survived as a distinct religion for over 2,000 years, maintaining its core principles and practices despite periods of persecution and social pressure, is impressive. Most religious movements from this period are long gone, but Jainism is still here, still convincing people that the path to liberation involves extreme non-violence and ascetic practice. That takes serious commitment and effective transmission of teachings across generations. The philosophical debates of this period weren't just abstract intellectual exercises, they had real social and political implications. When Buddhists argued that caste was irrelevant to spiritual attainment, they were challenging the entire social order. When Jains insisted on non-violence extending to all life forms, they were implicitly critiquing not just hunting and animal sacrifice, but also potentially warfare and all forms of violence. When materialists argued that there was no afterlife and no karma, They were undermining the entire framework of moral accountability that most religions relied on. These weren't polite academic discussions. They were arguing about fundamental questions of how society should be organized, what made authority legitimate, how people should live their lives, and what happened after death. The stakes were high, and the debates could get heated. Teachers would challenge each other in public, their reputations and livelihoods on the line. Kings would sponsor debates, using them as entertainment and as ways to test the relative merits of different philosophical positions. This period of open debate and philosophical competition was remarkably productive, generating ideas that would be discussed and developed for millennia. The contrast between this period and what came before is striking. The early Vedic period had a relatively clear religious consensus built around ritual sacrifice and the authority of Brahmins. By the Mahajanapadas period, that consensus had broken down completely. You had Buddhists rejecting the Vedas, Jains proposing their own path to liberation, materialists denying religion entirely, and various other schools proposing different answers to fundamental questions. The Brahminical tradition had to defend itself, refine its arguments, and develop new philosophical positions to respond to criticism. This competition ultimately strengthened all the traditions involved. They had to think more carefully, argue more rigorously, and develop more sophisticated philosophical positions. It's a reminder that intellectual and religious competition, when it doesn't devolve into violence, can be highly productive. Ideas get tested, weak arguments get exposed, and the traditions that survive do so because they offer something genuinely valuable to their adherents. The architectural achievements of the Mauryan period deserve mention as well. Ashoka's pillars scattered across his empire were engineering marvels, single pieces of stone, some over 40 feet tall, weighing many tons, transported from quarries to their final locations and erected securely. The pillars were polished to a mirror shine using techniques that we're still not entirely sure about. These weren't crude monuments. They were sophisticated works of art and engineering that compared favourably with anything being produced elsewhere in the ancient world. The fact that many of these pillars are still standing over 2,000 years later is testament to both the quality of their construction and the durability of the stone used. Ashoka wanted his messages to last forever, carved in stone and distributed across his empire so that everyone could read about his policies and his moral vision. It's ancient mass communication, using the most permanent medium available. We don't put up stone monuments much anymore. We have digital media that can reach everyone instantly. But digital media doesn't last 2,000 years. Ashoka's pillars do. The great Sanskrit epics, the Mahabharata and Ramayana, were probably beginning to take their current form during this period, though they were based on earlier oral traditions. These epics would become central to Hindu culture, told and retold in countless versions, providing moral examples, entertainment, and cultural touchstones for millions of people across millennia. The Mahabharata in particular is an enormous work, over 100,000 verses, making it the longest poem ever composed, that includes everything from detailed battle descriptions to philosophical dialogues to romantic subplots to digressions on law, ethics, and proper behaviour. It's less a single coherent narrative than an entire library of stories, myths, and teachings, all loosely organised around the central narrative of a dynastic war. You could spend a lifetime studying the Mahabharata and still find new things in it. The fact that it's been continuously important in Indian culture for over 2,000 years, constantly reinterpreted and adapted for new contexts, shows its remarkable depth and flexibility. The collapse of the Mauryan Empire and the subsequent period of fragmentation raised questions about political unity and Indian identity. Was the Mauryan unification just an anomaly, an artificially imposed unity that didn't reflect the natural diversity of the subcontinent? Or was it a lost golden age that future rulers should try to recreate? This tension between unity and diversity, between the practical advantages of political unification and the reality of regional, linguistic, and cultural differences, would continue throughout Indian history. Empires would rise and claim to unite India, would face the challenges of governing vast and diverse territories, would struggle with regional resistance and provincial autonomy, and would eventually fragment, leading to renewed political diversity. The pattern would repeat across dynasties and centuries, each empire trying to solve the problem of how to unify and govern such a large and diverse region, each eventually failing for various reasons, and each leaving its mark on Indian history and culture. The legacy of Ashoka in particular would wax and wane over the centuries. He was largely forgotten after the Mauryan collapse, his edicts unread, and their author unknown. Medieval Indian historians barely mentioned him, but in the modern era, when his edicts were deciphered and his reign reconstructed, Ashoka experienced a revival. Post-independence India embraced Ashoka as a symbol of Indian civilization at its best. Powerful but ethical, confident but compassionate, successful but spiritually aware. The fact that Ashoka ruled most of the subcontinent and did so while claiming to follow principles of non-violence and tolerance made him an attractive historical figure for a newly independent, democratic, secular India trying to define its identity. Whether the historical Ashoka actually lived up to this idealized image is debatable, but symbols don't have to be historically accurate to be powerful. Ashoka as symbol represents aspirations about what governance can be, about how power and ethics might be balanced, and about India's place in world history as a source of profound religious and philosophical traditions. That's not bad for an emperor who had been forgotten for over 1,000 years. The Mahajanapadas and Mauryan period, taken together, represent a crucial formative phase in Indian civilization. The political developments, the rise of kingdoms, the competition for dominance, the eventual unification under the Mauryas, and the subsequent fragmentation, established patterns that would recur repeatedly. The religious and philosophical developments, the emergence of Buddhism and Jainism, the debates between different schools of thought, the spread of these traditions beyond their place of origin, shaped not just India, but much of Asia. The social developments, the continued evolution of caste, the growth of cities and trade, the development of complex administrative systems, created structures that would persist for centuries. And some are just continuations of existing patterns, minor variations on established themes. But the period from the Mahajanapadas through the Mauryan Empire genuinely transformed the Indian subcontinent, establishing foundations that would influence everything that came after. The kingdoms would change, the dynasties would rise and fall, the religions would evolve, but the basic patterns established during these centuries would persist, shaping Indian civilization into the modern era. That's the mark of a genuinely significant historical period. Not just that interesting things happened, but that what happened continued to matter for thousands of years afterward, shaping the lives of billions of people who came later. By that measure, this period was about as significant as history gets. After the Mauryan Empire collapsed, northern India entered what historians politely call a period of fragmentation, which is the academic way of saying everything fell apart politically and stayed that way for quite a while. For about 5 centuries, from roughly 185 BCE to 320 CE, the subcontinent was divided among numerous kingdoms, many of them ruled by foreign dynasties who had swept in from Central Asia and established themselves as the new ruling class. The Indo-Greeks came first, descendants of Alexander's campaigns and the Hellenistic kingdoms that followed. Then came the Shakas, the Parthians, and most significantly the Kushans, who established a substantial empire in the northwest that became a major centre of Buddhist culture and the meeting point between Indian, Greek, Persian and Central Asian civilizations. This wasn't necessarily a dark age. Trade flourished, Buddhism spread, art and culture developed in interesting directions influenced by this mixing of traditions. But politically, it was messy, with no clear dominant power and constant competition between various kingdoms and dynasties. Then, around 320 CE, a new dynasty emerged that would reunite much of northern India and preside over what's often called the Golden Age of Indian civilization, the Guptas. Now, Golden Age is a term historians throw around maybe a bit too freely. Seems like every successful empire gets labelled a Golden Age by someone, but in the case of the Guptas, the label actually fits reasonably well. This was a period of remarkable achievement in science, mathematics, astronomy, literature, art and philosophy. The Gupta period didn't just maintain the cultural traditions of earlier eras, it actively expanded and refined them, producing works and discoveries that would influence human civilization for centuries. Not bad for a dynasty that most people today have never heard of, though to be fair, most people haven't heard of most dynasties. We can't all be as famous as the Romans, who had the advantage of conquering Europe and leaving ruins everywhere that are hard to ignore. The Gupta Empire was founded by a ruler named Chandragupta I, not to be confused with Chandragupta Maurya from several centuries earlier. Ancient India apparently had limited name diversity among ambitious rulers. This Chandragupta started with the kingdom of Magadha, the same region that had been the Mauryan power base, which suggests that geography matters in empire building. If you control the wealthy, populous, well-positioned core region, you have a good foundation for expansion. Chandragupta I ruled for about 15 years and did the usual empire-founding things, consolidated power, expanded territory, established alliances through marriage, and generally set the stage for his successors to build something bigger. He called it his successors would validate the claim, so let's call it confidence. His son, Samudragupta, who ruled from approximately 335 to 375 CE, was the real empire builder of the dynasty. Ancient inscriptions praise him as a mighty conqueror who defeated numerous kings, extended Gupta territory across much of northern India and into the Deccan, and supposedly never lost a battle. We should probably be a bit skeptical of royal propaganda. Defeated kings rarely commission inscriptions advertising their defeats, and victorious kings rarely undersell their achievements. But even accounting for exaggeration, Samudragupta clearly expanded Gupta power significantly. He also wasn't just a warrior. Inscriptions describe him as a patron of the arts who wrote poetry and played music. The image, Your Majesty, this poem is certainly something. Very royal, much imperial, but whether his poetry was any good or not, his patronage of culture set a tone for the dynasty. Under the Guptas, military success and cultural achievement weren't seen as contradictory. You could and should excel at both. Samudragupta's son, Chandragupta II, who ruled from approximately 375 to 415 CE, continued the expansion, and is often considered the greatest of the Gupta emperors. He conquered more territory, bringing Gujarat and other western regions under Gupta control, defeated the remaining Shaka kingdoms, and presided over the empire at its peak of power and prosperity. His court became a centre of learning and culture, attracting scholars, poets, and artists. One of the famous figures associated with Chandragupta II's court was the poet Kalidasa, often considered the greatest Sanskrit poet and dramatist. Kalidasa's works, plays like Shakuntala, poems like The Cloud Messenger, are masterpieces of Sanskrit literature, combining beautiful language with sophisticated psychological insight and emotional depth. They're still read and performed today, which is pretty good longevity for works of literature. Most writing from any era is forgotten within a generation or two. The fact that people are still reading and appreciating Kalidasa's work 17 centuries later suggests he was genuinely talented and not just getting by on royal patronage and literary nepotism. The Gupta Empire at its height controlled most of northern India, from the Bay of Bengal to the Arabian Sea, and exercised varying degrees of influence over kingdoms further south. But unlike the highly centralized Mauryan Empire with its detailed administrative structure, the Gupta Empire was more loosely organized. The core regions were under direct Gupta administration, but many areas were ruled by local kings who acknowledged Gupta overlordship, paid tribute, and provided military support when required, but otherwise had considerable autonomy. This decentralized feudal structure had advantages and disadvantages. On the plus side, it was easier to manage. You weren't trying to micromanage every province from the capital. Local rulers who knew their regions could handle local issues more effectively than distant imperial bureaucrats. On the downside, it meant the empire depended on the loyalty of these subordinate rulers, and loyalty is a commodity that can be withdrawn when circumstances change. When the Gupta emperors were strong and successful, loyalty was maintained. When they weakened, suddenly everyone remembered they were actually independent kingdoms, who had only been acknowledging Gupta overlordship as a courtesy. This pattern would repeat throughout Indian imperial history. Strong ruler builds empire, weaker successors watch it fragment. It's almost like political unity over large areas is inherently unstable without modern communications and transportation infrastructure. Who would have guessed? But let's talk about what made the Gupta period truly golden. The cultural and scientific achievements. This wasn't just an empire that conquered territory and collected taxes. This was an era when Indian civilization made contributions that would influence the entire world. Let's start with mathematics, because the Gupta period saw developments in this field that literally changed how humans do math. Now this zero, the number zero, how is that an invention? But actually, the concept of zero as a number, not just an absence of quantity, and particularly zero as a digit in a place value system, is a profound mathematical innovation that took a long time to develop. Early number systems around the world used various symbols to represent quantities, but most of them were additive systems where you just added up symbols. Roman numerals work this way. Zeph means 10 plus 5 plus 1 plus 1 equals 17. This works fine for basic arithmetic, but it's clunky for complex calculations. Try multiplying x by x7 in Roman numerals if you're feeling masochistic. Good luck. The Romans were excellent engineers and administrators, but their number system was holding them back mathematically. They knew this and often did calculations using different methods, then just wrote the results in Roman numerals. The Indian mathematicians of the Gupta period developed a much better system, a place-value decimal system where the position of a digit determines its value, and 0 serves as both a number and a placeholder. In this system, 207 means 200, 0 tens and 7 ones. The 0 is crucial. Without it, you can't distinguish between 27 and 207 and 2007. Suddenly, complex arithmetic becomes much more manageable. Addition, subtraction, multiplication and division can all be done with relatively simple algorithms that anyone can learn. You don't need to be a mathematical genius to do basic calculations. You just need to understand the system and follow the rules. This democratization of mathematics was revolutionary. It's not an exaggeration to say that modern science, engineering and commerce would be impossible without the decimal system including 0. Try doing advanced physics with Roman numerals. Actually don't. It would be a nightmare and you'd probably give up and become a philosophy major instead. The Indian numeral system, including 0, would eventually spread to the Arab world, which is why we call them Arabic numerals, even though Arabs called them Hindu numerals, correctly identifying their origin. From the Arab world, they spread to Europe in the medieval period, gradually replacing Roman numerals for calculation, though Roman numerals persisted for display purposes and still show up in certain contexts like clock faces and Super Bowl numbering, as if we need to make sporting events look more classical. The full impact of the Indian decimal system on world civilization cannot be overstated. It's one of those innovations that seems simple in retrospect, but was actually a major intellectual achievement that made countless other achievements possible. Indian mathematicians of the Gupta period also made progress in other areas. They worked on algebra, developing methods for solving various types of equations. They worked on geometry, calculating areas and volumes of various shapes. They worked on trigonometry, creating tables of sine functions that would be used for centuries. Aryabhata, he calculated pi as approximately 3.1416, which is accurate to 4 decimal places and was one of the most accurate calculations of pi achieved up to that point. He also correctly explained that the Earth rotates on its axis, which is why we see the apparent movement of stars across the night sky. This was not the common view in the ancient world. Most people thought the Earth was stationary and the heavens rotated around it. Aryabhata figured out the truth 1500 years ago, which is more than a millennium before this became accepted in Europe. Unfortunately, his correct view didn't become the dominant understanding even in India, and later Indian astronomers often reverted to geocentric models. Having the right answer early doesn't guarantee that everyone will accept it. Sometimes you're just ahead of your time, and the rest of humanity needs several more centuries to catch up. Astronomy was closely connected to mathematics in ancient India, partly because accurate astronomical calculations were important for creating calendars, which were in turn necessary for timing religious rituals and agricultural activities. Indian astronomers were careful observers of the sky, tracking the movements of the sun, moon, planets, and stars. They calculated the length of the solar year with remarkable accuracy. Aryabhata's calculation was off by only a few minutes compared to modern measurements. They predicted eclipses, understood that eclipses were caused by celestial mechanics rather than demons eating the sun or moon, and could calculate when eclipses would occur. They identified constellations, created star catalogues, and developed mathematical models to predict planetary positions. This was sophisticated work requiring careful observation, mathematical ability, and theoretical insight. And they were doing it without telescopes, computers, or any of the tools modern astronomers take for granted. Just eyes, careful record-keeping, and a lot of mathematical calculation. The fact that they achieved the level of accuracy they did is testament to both their dedication and their intellectual capabilities. Medicine was another field that advanced during the Gupta period. Indian medicine had a long tradition going back to earlier eras, but Gupta-era texts systematized and expanded medical knowledge. The great medical texts, the Charaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita, reached their final forms around this period. These texts They described hundreds of diseases and their treatments, discussed the properties of numerous medicinal plants, and included surgical procedures that were quite advanced for the time. The Sushruta Samhita describes over 300 surgical procedures and numerous surgical instruments. It includes plastic surgery techniques, including early forms of rhinoplasty, reconstructive nose surgery, which is particularly impressive considering this was being done in ancient India without anesthesia or antiseptics. The patient would presumably need to be quite brave and quite motivated to voluntarily undergo ancient surgery, knowing it would be extremely painful and might easily result in infection and death. But sometimes the alternative, living with a severe injury or disfigurement, was worse than the risk, so people took their chances with the surgeons. Fortunately, Indian surgeons apparently had good success rates, at least good enough that their techniques were valued and preserved. Indian medicine was based on a theory of 3 doshas, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha, bodily humours that needed to be balanced for good health. This is similar to the humoral theory that would dominate Western medicine for centuries, though with different specific details. From a modern scientific perspective, humoral theories of disease are wrong. Diseases are caused by pathogens, genetic factors, injuries, and various other specific causes, not by imbalances in mysterious bodily fluids. But in the context of ancient medicine, when you don't have microscopes to see bacteria and viruses, when you don't understand biochemistry or genetics, a theory that tries to explain health and disease in terms of balance and imbalance is not unreasonable. It at least provides a framework for thinking about health, and some of the practical advice that came from this system, eat a balanced diet, exercise moderately, avoid excesses, maintain good hygiene, was sound even if the theoretical justification was wrong. It's better than doing nothing or attributing all diseases to demonic possession or divine punishment, which were the alternatives in many ancient medical systems. At least Ayurvedic medicine was trying to be empirical, observing what treatments actually worked and preserving that knowledge, even if the explanatory framework was ultimately incorrect. Let's talk. Sanskrit literature flourished, producing works in various genres: poetry, drama, prose narratives, and fables. Kalidasa, as mentioned, was the superstar of Sanskrit drama and poetry. His play Shakuntala tells the story of a king who falls in love with a hermit's daughter, marries her, but then forgets her due to a curse, only to eventually remember and be reunited. It's a romantic drama with elements of comedy and pathos, written in beautiful Sanskrit verse, and it was hugely influential in Indian literature. When it was translated into European languages in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, it caused a sensation among European romantic poets and writers who had never encountered classical Indian literature before. Goethe wrote a famous poem praising Shakuntala. The play demonstrated that ancient India had a sophisticated literary tradition equal to anything in classical Greece or Rome, which was a revelation to Europeans who had generally assumed that only European classical civilizations had produced great literature. Kalidasa's other works, plays like Vikramorvasiyam and Malavikagnimitram, and poems like Raghuvamsha and Kumarasambhava, were also highly regarded and remain classics of Sanskrit literature. But Kalidasa wasn't alone. The Gupta period produced numerous other accomplished writers. There was Vishakadatta, who wrote political dramas, Bharavi, who wrote an epic poem called Kiratarjunya, Dandin, who wrote both poetry and prose works including the Dashakumara Charita, a prose romance that's extremely entertaining. It's full of adventures, love affairs, separations, reunions, disguises, and dramatic twists. It's basically the ancient Indian equivalent of a page-turning adventure novel, and it's still readable and enjoyable today if you can find a good translation. The fact that ancient Indian writers understood how to construct entertaining narratives with complex plots, well-drawn characters, and emotional depth shouldn't be surprising. Humans have always enjoyed stories, but it's sometimes forgotten that ancient doesn't mean primitive or boring. People in ancient India wanted entertainment just like people today, and their writers provided it, using many of the same narrative techniques that modern writers use. The great Sanskrit epics, the Mahabharata and Ramayana, reached their final forms during or shortly before the Gupta period, though they were based on much older oral traditions. These epics became absolutely central to Hindu culture, providing not just entertainment but also religious teachings, moral exemplars, and cultural identity. The Mahabharata, it tells the story of a great war between two branches of a royal family, but that's just the frame story. Embedded within it are countless other stories, philosophical discussions, legal and ethical teachings, and detailed descriptions of everything from how to conduct a horse sacrifice to what happens to different types of souls after death. The Bhagavad Gita, one of the most important Hindu religious texts, is actually just one small section of the Mahabharata, a dialogue between the warrior Arjuna and the god Krishna about duty, action, devotion, and the nature of reality. The Gita has been endlessly commented upon, interpreted and analysed, and it remains central to Hindu philosophy and devotional practice. The fact that this profound philosophical and religious text is embedded in a much larger epic about a war and family conflict is characteristically Indian, The spiritual and the worldly, the profound and the entertaining, all mixed together in a way that refuses to separate them into distinct categories. The Ramayana tells the story of Rama, a prince who is exiled from his kingdom, whose wife Sita is kidnapped by the demon king Ravana, and who must rescue her with the help of the monkey god Hanuman and his army. It's a story of heroism, devotion, duty, and the triumph of good over evil. It's also been retold countless times in countless versions across South and Southeast Asia, adapted to local cultures, languages, and values, but always maintaining its core narrative. The story has everything: action, romance, comedy, tragedy, moral lessons, and characters that have become archetypal in Indian culture. Rama represents the ideal king and the ideal man, devoted to duty even at great personal cost. Sita represents the ideal wife, devoted and virtuous even when suffering unjustly. Hanuman represents devotion and service. Ravana, despite being the villain, is complex, powerful, learned, but brought down by his own arrogance and desire. These characters and their stories have shaped how millions of people think about proper behavior, devotion, duty, and morality for over 2,000 years. Not many works of literature can claim that kind of sustained cultural influence. Art and architecture also flourished during the Gupta period. The Gupta artistic style represented a classical ideal that would influence Indian art for centuries. Sculptures from this period, whether of Hindu deities, Buddhist figures, or Jain Tirthankaras, display a refined elegance and naturalistic representation, combined with idealized beauty. The proportions are carefully calculated, the poses graceful, the expression serene. It's classical art in the sense that it achieves a balance between naturalism and idealization, between technical skill and spiritual expression. The sculptures aren't just displaying technical ability, they're trying to convey something about the divine, about the spiritual reality behind the physical form. A statue, whether it succeeds, is probably subjective and depends on the viewer's own spiritual sensibility, but the ambition itself is noteworthy. The cave temples of Ajanta, though they began in earlier periods, reached their full glory during the Gupta era. These weren't simple caves, they were elaborate complexes carved out of solid rock, with pillared halls, shrines, and most spectacularly, extensive murals covering the walls and ceilings. The Ajanta murals depict scenes from the Buddha's life and previous lives, court scenes, daily life, and various Buddhist teachings, all rendered in vivid colours using natural pigments. The quality of the painting is extraordinary. The artist understood perspective, foreshortening, shading, and composition. The figures are expressive, the scenes are dynamic, and the whole effect is visually stunning. These murals have survived 1,500 years, though they've faded considerably from their original brilliance, and they remain some of the finest examples of ancient Indian painting. The fact that they were created on cave walls using natural pigments, working by lamplight since there's obviously no natural light deep in a cave, makes the achievement even more impressive. Try painting intricate scenes on a rough rock surface in dim lighting and see how well you do. Actually, architecture during the Gupta period saw the development of the classic Hindu temple form. Earlier Indian religious architecture had focused on stupas for Buddhism and rock-cut caves, but the Guptas began building freestanding temples dedicated to Hindu deities. These early temples were relatively small and simple compared to the enormous temple complexes that would be built in later centuries, but they established the basic form: a sanctum housing the deity's image, a porch or mandapa for worshippers, and a tower or shikara rising above the sanctum. The temples were decorated with elaborate carvings of deities, mythological scenes, and decorative motifs. The entire temple was conceived as a kind of cosmos in miniature, a sacred space where the earthly and divine realms intersected, and where devotees could come to worship and make offerings. The temple as a centre of community life, religious practice, and artistic patronage would become central to Hindu culture, and it all started taking its characteristic form during the Gupta period. The Natya classical Indian music and dance have complex theoretical frameworks covering rhythm, melody, emotional expression, and aesthetic principles. There are 9 rasas: love, mirth, sorrow, anger, energy, fear, disgust, wonder, and peace. This isn't just entertainment, it's a sophisticated theory of how art affects human emotion and consciousness. Indian classical music and dance, with their emphasis on improvisation within traditional structures, on subtle emotional expression, and on the spiritual dimensions of artistic performance, became highly developed and remain living traditions practiced today, over a millennium and a half later. Not many performance traditions last that long, while maintaining both their technical sophistication and their cultural relevance. The Gupta period was also a time of religious development and synthesis. Hinduism was evolving into what we might recognize as classical Hinduism, distinct from the earlier Vedic religion. The focus was shifting from ritual sacrifice to devotional worship of personal deities. Bhakti, the devotional movement that emphasized love and devotion to a chosen god or goddess as the path to salvation. The major Hindu deities, Vishnu, Shiva, and Devi, the goddess in her various forms, were being elaborated in mythology and theology. Temples dedicated to these deities were being built, providing focal points for worship and community gathering. Religious teachers and philosophers were composing texts that explained Hindu theology, practice, and philosophy in systematic ways. Hinduism was becoming more organized, more textually grounded, and more focused on devotional practice accessible to ordinary people rather than just elaborate rituals that only trained priests could perform. This made Hinduism more competitive with Buddhism and Jainism, which had always emphasized paths accessible to lay people. If you're going to keep your religious market share, you need to offer something that appeals to the average person, not just to specialists and monastics. Buddhism continued to be practiced during the Gupta period, though it was beginning its gradual decline in India. The Gupta emperors were generally Hindu in their personal religious practice, but were tolerant of other religions and supported Buddhist institutions as well. Nalanda, which would become the most famous Buddhist university in ancient India, was founded during the Gupta period or shortly before. Nalanda attracted students from across Asia who came to study Buddhism, philosophy, logic, medicine, astronomy, and other subjects. At its peak in later centuries, it would house thousands of monks and students, maintain an enormous library, and function as a true university in the modern sense. A community of scholars engaged in teaching, research, and debate. The fact that ancient India developed institutional universities where students and teachers lived together, studied various subjects, engaged in research and debate, and produced scholarship is sometimes overlooked in discussions of ancient education. People often think universities are a medieval European invention, but actually institutions serving similar functions existed in ancient India centuries earlier. They looked different. They had different organizational structures, but the core idea, a residential community devoted to advanced learning, was definitely present. One area, the caste system, became more rigid and more elaborate during this period. The law codes composed during and after the Gupta era prescribed detailed rules about which castes could do which occupations, who could marry whom, who could eat with whom, and various other aspects of daily life. The position of women also became more restricted. Earlier periods had allowed women more freedom in some areas. Women composed Vedic hymns, women owned property, women participated in philosophical debates. By the Gupta period and after, women's roles were increasingly confined to domestic spheres. Their education was limited, practices like child marriage were becoming more common, and the ideal woman was defined primarily by her devotion to her husband. The famous phrase Pati Parmeshwar, husband as God, comes from this tradition. The idea that a woman should worship her husband as she would worship a deity, that her spiritual practice consisted primarily of serving him, represents a constriction of women's roles that earlier periods didn't enforce as rigorously. It's a reminder that cultural golden ages are often golden for some people more than others. If you're a woman or a person from the lower castes, the Gupta period is probably less golden. Your opportunities are limited, your social mobility is essentially nil, and the dominant ideology tells you that your lowly position is a result of your karma from past lives, and that you should accept it rather than trying to change it. It's convenient theology if you're on top, less so if you're not. The Gupta Empire began to decline in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. One significant factor was the Huna invasions. The Hunas, sometimes identified with the Hephthalites or White Huns, were Central Asian nomadic peoples who began raiding and invading northern India in the late 5th century. The Guptas fought them with mixed success. Some Gupta rulers managed to defeat Huna invaders, but the constant warfare was expensive and exhausting. Eventually the Hunas established their own kingdoms in parts of northern India, and the Gupta Empire's territory and power contracted. Internal factors also played a role. The decentralized feudal structure of the Gupta Empire meant that provincial governors and subordinate kings had significant autonomy, and as the central Gupta authority weakened, they increasingly acted independently. The empire fragmented as regions and kingdoms that had previously acknowledged Gupta overlordship decided they were actually independent. It's the familiar pattern. Strong emperor maintains unity, weak emperor loses it, and suddenly the empire is just a collection of independent states that used to be unified. By around 550 CE, the Gupta Empire existed only in a much reduced form, controlling parts of north-central India, but no longer the vast territories it had ruled at its peak. By 650 CE, even that remnant was gone, and northern India was once again fragmented among various kingdoms. The political unity was lost, though the cultural achievements of the Gupta period remained influential. Literature, art, and philosophy don't disappear when the empire that produced them falls. They persist, they're copied and studied, they influence later generations. The decimal system doesn't stop working because the Gupta Empire collapsed. Kalidasa's plays don't become less beautiful because there's no longer a Gupta emperor. Scientific knowledge doesn't evaporate when political unity is lost. In that sense, the Gupta Golden Age had a lasting impact far beyond the political lifespan of the Gupta dynasty itself. The post-Gupta period would see the rise of various regional kingdoms, some of which would achieve considerable power and produce their own cultural achievements. The Chalukyas in the Deccan, the Pallavas in the south, the Pratiharas, Palas and Rashtrakutas competing for control of northern India. All these kingdoms would leave their marks on Indian history. But the memory of the Gupta period as a golden age persisted, a time when India was united, prosperous and culturally accomplished. Later historians looking back would use the Gupta period as a benchmark, a standard against which to measure other eras. Whether this idealization was entirely fair, whether the Gupta period was really as golden as later memory claimed, is debatable. Every era, but the achievements were real enough. Mathematical innovations that changed how humans do math, astronomical observations and calculations of remarkable accuracy, literary works of enduring beauty and insight, artistic expressions that combined technical skill with spiritual depth, and a general cultural flourishing that influenced not just India, but eventually the world. The Gupta Golden Age reminds us that cultural achievement and political power don't always align perfectly. The Mauryan Empire was larger and more politically powerful than the Gupta Empire, but it's the Gupta period that's remembered as the cultural Golden Age. Political domination doesn't automatically produce great art, literature or science. Those require the right conditions: patronage that supports cultural production, institutions that preserve and transmit knowledge, freedom for intellectual inquiry and debate, and frankly, a certain amount of peace and prosperity, so that people can focus on things beyond basic survival. The Gupta period apparently provided those conditions, at least for the privileged classes, and the results justify calling it a golden age, even if we need to remember that golden ages are rarely golden for everyone, and that the cultural achievements we celebrate were built on a foundation of social hierarchy and exploitation that we wouldn't celebrate if we looked at it too closely. History, the same period, can produce both mathematical brilliance and social oppression, magnificent literature and rigid caste restrictions, profound philosophical insights, and limited opportunities for half the population. We can appreciate the achievements while acknowledging the limitations, celebrate the works of genius while recognizing the injustices, and learn from both the successes and the failures. That's probably the best we can do when looking back at any historical period, Golden Age or otherwise. Let's dig deeper into the daily realities of life during the Gupta period, because all these magnificent cultural achievements were happening against a backdrop of ordinary people going about their lives in ways that would seem both familiar and utterly foreign to modern observers. The cities of the Gupta period were substantial urban centres, though smaller than the great Mauryan cities of earlier centuries. They had markets, workshops, temples, palaces and residential quarters, organised roughly by occupation and caste. The streets would have been crowded with merchants selling goods, craftspeople working at their trades, priests going to and from temples, officials conducting government business, and ordinary people going about their daily errands. It would have been noisy, smelly. Ancient cities didn't have sewage systems as good as the Indus Valley civilization had possessed 2,000 years earlier, unfortunately, and vibrant with activity. Cities were centres of opportunity but also of disease, crime and social tension. The romanticised image of the ancient city as a place of beauty and culture is partially true, but only if you ignore the open sewers, the lack of sanitation, the periodic outbreaks of disease, and the stark poverty that existed alongside great wealth. The economy was diverse and, for the privileged classes, relatively prosperous. Agriculture remained the foundation, as it had been and would remain until industrialization. The Gupta period saw continued development of agricultural techniques, expansion of cultivated land, and sophisticated irrigation systems in some regions. Farmers grew a variety of crops depending on climate and soil: rice in wet areas, wheat and barley in drier regions, various pulses, vegetables, fruits, and cash crops like cotton and sugarcane. Agricultural surplus supported not just the farming population, but also the cities, the armies, the temples, the courts, and all the specialists who weren't directly producing food. Without farmers consistently producing more than they needed to survive, none of the cultural achievements we celebrate would have been possible. You can't spend your life writing Sanskrit poetry if you need to spend all day growing food. Someone has to grow that food, and historically that someone has been the vast majority of the population labouring in fields. The cultural golden age was built on agricultural surplus extracted through taxation, and the beauty of Kalidas's poetry probably wasn't much consolation to farmers struggling to pay their taxes and feed their families. Trade was extensive both within India and with regions beyond. Indian exports included cotton textiles, which were highly prized across Asia and the Middle East for their quality. Spices like pepper and cinnamon commanded high prices in distant markets. Precious stones, worked metal goods, and various luxury items found buyers across a vast trade network. In return, India imported horses from Central Asia. Indian-bred horses apparently weren't suitable for heavy cavalry warfare, so war horses were a major import item. Gold and silver were imported to meet India's insatiable demand for precious metals, which were used for coins, jewellery, and temple decoration. Various luxury goods from China, Southeast Asia, Persia, and the Roman Empire found their way to India. The trade routes were long and dangerous, crossing mountains, deserts, and seas, but the profit margins made the risks worthwhile for those daring or desperate enough to try. A successful merchant could become wealthy, though merchant families generally ranked below warriors and priests in social prestige, which must have been somewhat annoying. I risked my life crossing the mountains, outsmarted bandits, negotiated complex deals in 3 languages, and made a fortune, but I still have to defer to this Brahmin who's never left his village, and this Kshatriya whose primary skill is hitting people with swords. The social hierarchy seems flawed somehow. The guild system remained important, with various crafts and trades organised into guilds that regulated training, maintained standards, and represented their members' interests. Guilds could become quite powerful and wealthy, sometimes lending money to kings and merchants, essentially functioning as early banking institutions. The relationship between guild masters, journeymen, and apprentices created a training system that transmitted technical knowledge across generations. If you wanted to become a skilled metalworker, you became an apprentice to a master metalworker, spent years learning the craft, eventually became competent enough to be considered a journeyman, and if you were good enough and lucky enough, might eventually become a master yourself and take on your own apprentices. This system worked reasonably well for preserving and transmitting technical knowledge, though it wasn't exactly meritocratic. Your chances of becoming a successful craftsperson depended heavily on your caste, your family connections, and whether you could afford to spend years in training rather than earning money immediately. Social mobility was limited but not completely absent. A talented craftsperson from a lower caste might not become a Brahmin, but they could become prosperous within their own social stratum, which was about as much as you could hope for in a caste-based society. Education during the Gupta period was primarily the preserve of the upper castes, particularly Brahmins. Traditionally, this education took place in gurukulas, where students lived with their teacher and learned through a combination of memorization, recitation, discussion, and practical application. The emphasis was on oral transmission. Even though writing existed and was used, the primary method of preserving and transmitting knowledge was still memorization and oral recitation. The training was rigorous and started young, often continuing for years or decades depending on how much you wanted to learn. It produced individuals with phenomenal memories and deep knowledge of their tradition, though whether this was the most efficient way to educate people is debatable. When you spend years memorizing texts that you could theoretically just write down and reference when needed, you're making a choice to prioritize oral tradition over efficiency. But maybe something is gained through the deep engagement with texts that memorization requires. Or maybe oral cultures just do things differently, and it's not fair to judge them by literate standards. For people outside the upper castes, education was more limited and practical. You learned your family's trade or occupation through hands-on training and observation. If your father was a potter, you became a potter. If your mother was a weaver, you learned weaving. There was no formal schooling in the modern sense for most people. You learned by doing, guided by family members who knew the trade. This limited your options considerably. You couldn't easily decide you wanted to do something completely different from what your family did, because you wouldn't have access to the training and you'd face social sanctions for violating caste occupational boundaries. The system, when your entire identity is wrapped up in being part of a particular occupational caste doing a particular type of work, radical career changes aren't really on the table. Women's education was particularly limited. Upper caste women might receive some education in religion, music and domestic arts, but access to serious scholarly education was rare and becoming rarer as the Gupta period progressed. The idea there were exceptions, the existence of exceptions, is precisely what makes them notable, but they were becoming less common. Earlier periods had women composing hymns, debating philosophy, and participating in intellectual life. By the Gupta period and after, this was increasingly uncommon. Women were being written out of intellectual life, and the justifications were increasingly religious and philosophical. Women were naturally less capable of higher learning, the texts claimed. Women's dharma was different from men's. They achieved spiritual merit through devotion to their husbands, not through independent spiritual practice or learning. These ideas became more entrenched over time, making it increasingly difficult for women to participate in cultural and intellectual life, even if they had the ability and interest. It's one of those historical developments where things got worse rather than better, where freedoms that existed earlier were gradually restricted until they became almost unthinkable. Religious life during the Gupta period was diverse and vibrant. Temples were becoming more elaborate and more central to religious practice. Temple worship involved making offerings to deity images, flowers, incense, food, cloth, various precious items, while priests performed rituals and devotees sang hymns and prayers. The deity was treated as an honoured guest, awakened in the morning, bathed, dressed, offered breakfast, worshipped throughout the day, offered lunch and dinner, and finally put to bed at night. This anthropomorphic treatment of divine images might seem strange from some perspectives. Does God really need breakfast? But it reflects a devotional understanding where the relationship between devotee and deity is personal and intimate, more like the relationship between a servant and a beloved master than like the abstract philosophical relationship between finite and infinite that other religious traditions emphasize. Bhakti devotionalism, which was flourishing during this period, emphasized this loving, personal relationship with the divine. You didn't just respect or fear the deity, you loved them, served them, longed for them, expressed your devotion through songs and poetry and dance and offerings. It was intensely emotional, deeply personal, and accessible to anyone regardless of caste or education. You didn't need to understand philosophy or perform complex rituals. You just needed devotion, love, and sincerity. Pilgrimage was an important aspect of religious life. Holy sites associated with various deities or religious teachers attracted pilgrims from across India and beyond. Pilgrimage served multiple functions. It was a religious act that earned spiritual merit. It was an opportunity to see new places and meet new people, and it was a way to demonstrate devotion and piety. For people whose lives were often confined to their local area, pilgrimage might be one of the few opportunities to travel and experience different regions and cultures. The hardships of travel, the distance, the danger, the expense were part of the point. Pilgrimage wasn't supposed to be easy. If it was easy, it wouldn't be spiritually meritorious. You were demonstrating your devotion precisely by enduring difficulty to reach the holy site. And once you arrived, you participated in rituals, made offerings, received blessings from priests, and probably also bought souvenirs to bring back home to prove you'd actually made the journey. Religious tourism isn't a modern invention. People have been travelling to holy sites and buying mementos for millennia. The only difference is that ancient pilgrims couldn't post selfies on social media to document their journey, which was probably unfortunate from their perspective, but saved their friends and family from having to look at travel photos. Festivals were major events in the religious calendar, times when entire communities came together to celebrate. Hindu festivals often involved processions, music, dance, dramatic performances, feasting, and various rituals. These weren't solemn occasions, they were celebrations, joyful and exuberant. The spring festival of Holi, where people throw coloured powder at each other, was already being celebrated. Diwali, the festival of lights, involved lamps, fireworks, and celebrations of the triumph of light over darkness. These festivals provided entertainment and social bonding opportunities in societies that didn't have movies, television, or any of the commercial entertainment infrastructure we take for granted. When your daily life is work and more work, with little leisure and few diversions, festivals are incredibly important. They break up the monotony. They give you something to look forward to. They provide communal experiences that bind people together. And they're fun, which shouldn't be overlooked as a motivation. Humans need fun. We're not built to just work constantly without breaks or celebrations or opportunities for joy. Ancient peoples understood this, which is why every culture has festivals, holidays, and celebrations built into the calendar. The specific details vary, but the basic need for periodic celebration is universal. These texts covered criminal law, civil law, family law, property law, and various other legal matters, all framed in terms of dharma, religious duty and proper behavior. Courts were run by officials appointed by the king, with Brahmins often serving as legal experts who could interpret the law texts. Punishments varied depending on the crime and the caste of the offender. A Brahmin who committed a crime might face lighter punishment than a Shudra who committed the same crime, which is obviously unjust by modern standards, but was considered appropriate within the caste framework. The king was supposed to maintain justice, punish wrongdoers, and protect the innocent, but he also had significant discretion. Royal justice wasn't always just, and corruption was probably common, as it tends to be in systems where officials have power and limited oversight. Still, having a legal system with established rules and procedures is better than having no system at all, even if the system is imperfect and biased. At least there's some framework for resolving disputes and punishing crimes, rather than just leaving everything to private revenge or the arbitrary whims of whoever has power. Warfare during the Gupta period was sophisticated by ancient standards. Armies were composed of 4 traditional divisions: infantry, cavalry, chariots, and elephants. Chariots were actually becoming obsolete by this period, replaced by cavalry as the primary mobile striking force, but they maintained symbolic importance. Elephants were still used extensively in Indian warfare. They were intimidating, powerful, and useful, both for breaking enemy formations and for carrying commanders who could survey the battlefield from height. Training war elephants was a specialized skill, and elephants were expensive to maintain. They eat enormous amounts of food, but they were worth it for their shock value and tactical utility. Imagine being an infantry soldier facing a charging war elephant. That's terrifying in a way that a horse isn't, though cavalry charges are certainly scary enough. The psychological impact of elephants in warfare shouldn't be underestimated, though they also had disadvantages. Elephants could panic, stampede, and trample their own side. Elephants could be killed or wounded, at which point they became liabilities rather than assets. But when properly trained and deployed, they were formidable weapons. Infantry formed the bulk of most armies, foot soldiers armed with spears, swords, bows, and shields. They weren't professional soldiers in the modern sense. Many were peasants who owed military service to their lords or who were conscripted when needed. Fighting quality varied considerably depending on training and motivation. Elite units and personal guards of nobles were probably well trained and equipped. Ordinary conscripts were probably less impressive, given basic weapons and minimal training and thrown into battle hoping they'd do their duty rather than run away. Cavalry, as mentioned, was the prestigious branch, and good cavalry horses were expensive imports. The warrior elite, the Kshatriyas, were supposed to excel at warfare. It was their dharmic duty to fight and protect society. Training in weapons and warfare was part of their education from childhood. The code of warfare emphasized honor, courage, and proper conduct. You weren't supposed to attack unarmed opponents, strike enemies who had surrendered, or kill non-combatants. Whether these rules were followed in practice is another question. Codes of honorable warfare tend to be honored more in the breach than the observance when actual survival is at stake. But at least the ideal existed that warfare should have rules and limits. The position of the king in Gupta society was theoretically absolute but practically limited. The king was supposed to be the protector of dharma, the enforcer of social order, the patron of religion and culture, and the supreme judge and military commander. In theory, his power was unlimited within his kingdom. In practice, he had to work with and through various power structures: the Brahmin priests who provided religious legitimacy and advice, the warrior nobles who commanded armies and controlled territory, the merchant guilds who controlled much of the economy, and the bureaucrats who actually administered the kingdom. A king who tried to rule without regard to these groups would find his power very limited very quickly. Successful kings maintained a balance, using their various supporting groups effectively, while not letting any one group gain too much independent power. It was a constant political balancing act, and kings who did it poorly tended to have short reigns, either overthrown by rivals or reduced to powerless figureheads, while actual power was exercised by others. The scientific and mathematical achievements of the Gupta period deserve even more emphasis because they were truly revolutionary. The decimal place value system with 0 wasn't just a clever mathematical trick. It was a conceptual breakthrough that made modern mathematics and science possible. Without this system, algebra would be far more difficult, calculus would probably be impossible, and all the mathematical sciences that depend on advanced mathematics would be crippled. Computer science, physics, engineering, economics all depend fundamentally on mathematical notation that traces back to the Indian decimal system. The fact that this breakthrough happened in ancient India and then spread across the world is one of India's greatest contributions to human civilization. It's not as famous as building pyramids or conquering empires, but it's arguably more important. Pyramids are impressive, but they don't make differential equations possible. The astronomical work was similarly significant. Understanding that the Earth rotates rather than the heavens revolving around a stationary Earth is a major conceptual leap. Calculating planetary positions, predicting eclipses, measuring the length of the year with great accuracy, these require both careful observation and sophisticated mathematics. The fact that ancient Indian astronomers achieved these things shows that they were doing real science, not just mystical stargazing. They were making observations, developing theories, testing predictions, and refining their models. That's the scientific method, even if they wouldn't have called it that. And they were doing it competently, achieving results that were often more accurate than what astronomers in other parts of the world were achieving at the same time. It's another example of Indian civilization being at the forefront of human knowledge in specific areas, producing insights and discoveries that would eventually benefit all of humanity when they spread beyond India's borders. The Gupta period demonstrates that cultural golden ages are fragile and context-dependent. The same conditions that produced great art, literature, and science, peace, prosperity, patronage, intellectual freedom, can disappear quite quickly when political circumstances change. The Huna invasions disrupted trade, destroyed cities, killed scholars, and generally made it hard to focus on writing poetry or calculating planetary positions when you were worried about survival. The fragmentation that followed the Gupta collapse meant that patronage became more limited and fragmented. Individual kingdoms might support culture and learning, but they didn't have the resources of a large empire. The subsequent period saw continued cultural production. It's not like India stopped having literature, art, or science after the Guptas, but it wasn't at the same level of fluorescence and innovation. Golden ages don't last, which is why they're called golden ages rather than just normal times. They're exceptional periods when multiple factors align favourably, and when those factors change, the golden age ends. But the legacy endures in ways that transcend the political rise and fall of dynasties. The mathematical innovation spread across the world and changed how humans do mathematics forever. The artistic styles influenced later Indian art and art across Asia. The science, a golden age, even a brief one, can have impacts that last far beyond its own time. The Gupta period lasted only a few centuries as a political entity, but its cultural legacy has lasted over a millennium and a half and continues to matter today. That's the real measure of a golden age, not just what happened during it, but what came after, the seeds planted that grew into something larger and more lasting than the empire itself. By that measure, the Gupta Golden Age deserves its reputation. After the Gupta Empire crumbled in the 6th and 7th centuries, India entered what historians call the medieval period. Though using European periodization for Indian history is admittedly a bit arbitrary, since India wasn't experiencing feudalism and crusades like Europe was. But we need to call it something, and that really long complicated period between the Guptas and the Mughals when nobody managed to unify everything doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. So medieval India it is. This period, roughly from 600 to 1200 CE, was characterized by political fragmentation, with numerous regional kingdoms competing for dominance, forming and breaking alliances, and generally making the political map look like it was being constantly redrawn by someone who couldn't make up their mind. But don't mistake political fragmentation for cultural stagnation or economic decline. This was actually a remarkably dynamic period with flourishing trade, impressive architectural achievements, sophisticated administrative systems at the regional level, and continuous cultural development. It just lacked the tidy narrative of a single empire dominating everything, which makes it harder to teach in history class, but probably more accurately reflects how most of human history actually works: messy, regional, and complicated. 3 major powers emerged in the north during the early medieval period, competing in what historians call the tripartite struggle, which sounds dramatic and official, but basically means 3-way fight that went on for way too long. These were the Pratiharas, who controlled much of northwestern and central India, the Palas, who dominated Bengal and Bihar in the east, and the Rashtrakutas, who ruled the Deccan Plateau in the south. These three dynasties spent roughly 2 centuries, from about 750 to 950 CE, fighting each other for control of Kanauj, a city in the northern plains that had symbolic importance as a former imperial capital and practical importance as a wealthy urban centre controlling important trade routes. Whoever held Kanauj could claim to be the paramount power in northern India, which was good for prestige even if it didn't necessarily translate into actual control over distant regions. It's like being crowned homecoming king, technically an honour, practically meaningless, but people will fight surprisingly hard for the title anyway. The Pratiharas, also called the Gurjara Pratiharas, were the most successful of the three for much of this period, controlling Kanauj for extended stretches and pushing their authority over a vast swathe of northern India. The Pratiharas claimed descent from the legendary hero Lakshmana from the Ramayana epic, which is a nice bit of mythological legitimation, but tells us more about their propaganda than their actual ancestry. Everyone in medieval India claimed descent from some legendary hero or ancient royal lineage because admitting you were the descendants of random people who got lucky and grabbed power didn't have the same ring to it. The Pratihara rulers were successful military commanders who expanded their kingdom through conquest, but they also understood that holding territory requires more than just winning battles. They established an administrative system, patronized religion and culture, and tried to maintain order across their domains, which was no easy task when your empire stretched hundreds of miles and communication took weeks or months. The Palas controlled eastern India, with their heartland in Bengal and Bihar. They were notable for several reasons. First, they were strong Buddhist patrons at a time when Buddhism was declining in most of India, absorbed back into the Hindu mainstream or losing institutional support. The palace supported Buddhist monasteries and universities, most famously Nalanda, which reached its peak as a centre of Buddhist learning under Pala patronage. Nalanda attracted students from across Asia, Tibet, China, Korea, Southeast Asia, making it one of the most cosmopolitan educational institutions in the medieval world. Students came to study Buddhist philosophy, logic, medicine, astronomy, and various other subjects under renowned scholar monks. The library was said to contain hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Though these numbers might be exaggerated, medieval sources tend to be optimistic when counting books, armies, and basically anything else where bigger numbers sound more impressive. Still, even if the library was smaller than claimed, it was clearly a major repository of knowledge, and its eventual destruction by invaders centuries later was a catastrophic loss of texts and learning that can never be recovered. It's the ancient equivalent of losing the internet, except you can't just restore from backup because there was no backup. The Rashtrakutas controlled the Deccan Plateau from their capital at Manyaketa in modern Karnataka. But their location in the Deccan meant they were fighting on multiple fronts, against the Pratiharas and Palas in the north, against southern kingdoms like the Cholas, and sometimes against rebellious subordinate rulers within their own territories. Fighting everybody simultaneously is exhausting and expensive, which might explain why the Rashtrakutas, despite their military success, eventually collapsed from internal rebellions and external pressures. The Rashtrakutas were also great patrons of architecture and art. They sponsored the construction of some of India's most impressive rock-cut temples, including the Kailasa temple at Ellora, which is genuinely mind-blowing when you see it. The entire temple, a multi-story structure with elaborate carvings, courtyards and shrines, was carved out of a single massive rock face. They didn't build it by stacking stones. They excavated it by removing stone, carving downward and inward to create a freestanding structure that was never actually built, but rather revealed from the living rock. It's one of those achievements that makes you wonder how they even planned it, let alone executed it with the tools available in the 8th century. So we're going to carve an entire temple complex out of solid rock. That sounds difficult. Oh, it will be. We'll need several generations of sculptors and thousands of workers. Is there an easier way? Probably, but this will look amazing. And it does look amazing, so point to the Rashtrakutas for commitment to the project. The tripartite struggle eventually wound down without a clear victor. The Pratiharas weakened due to internal dissension and external attacks. The Rashtrakutas collapsed into civil war and were replaced by other dynasties. The Palas contracted back to Bengal and eventually were supplanted there as well. By the end of the 10th century, none of the three major contenders were particularly powerful anymore, and northern India fragmented further into smaller kingdoms. This kind of cyclical rise and fall was typical of the period. A dynasty would emerge, build power through military success and skillful administration, reach a peak, then decline due to succession disputes, financial problems, military defeats, or combinations thereof, and be replaced by another dynasty that would repeat the cycle. It's the medieval Indian version of the saying history repeats itself, except instead of learning from history, everyone just kept making the same mistakes. You'd think after watching several dynasties collapse from succession disputes and regional rebellions, rulers might implement better succession systems or more effective provincial control, but apparently not. Each generation had to learn these lessons the hard way. While all this fighting was happening in the north, the south of India was developing its own distinct political and cultural patterns. The Deccan and southern India were never as politically unified as the north, partly because of geography. Mountains, rivers and forests created natural barriers that made large-scale political unification difficult, and partly because southern kingdoms were strong enough to resist northern expansion attempts. The major powers in the south during this period were the Chalukyas, who succeeded the Rashtrakutas in the Deccan, the Pallavas, who controlled much of Tamil Nadu from their capital at Kanchi, and eventually the Cholas, who would build one of the most impressive medieval empires in all of Asia, though we're getting ahead of ourselves. The Chalukyas were actually two dynasties, the early Chalukyas who ruled from the 6th to 8th centuries, and the later Chalukyas who ruled from the 10th to 12th centuries, with the Rashtrakutas sandwiched in between. This reappearance of the same dynastic name is either evidence of continuity or just confusing depending on your perspective. The Chalukyas were great builders, creating temple complexes at Badami, Aihola and Pattadakal that represent some of the finest examples of early Hindu temple architecture. They also patronized literature and scholarship, with their courts producing works in Sanskrit and regional languages. The Chalukya kings fought constantly with their neighbours. Warfare was basically the default state of affairs, but they also found time to build, patronize culture, and generally do the things that successful medieval rulers did when they weren't actively conquering or defending their territories. The Pallavas were one of the more culturally influential southern dynasties despite not being the most militarily powerful. They sponsored the development of Tamil literature and Sanskrit learning. They built remarkable temples, most famously at Mamallapuram, where elaborate rock-cut shrines and monolithic sculptures still stand on the seashore, having survived over 1,000 years of salt air and monsoon rains. The shore temple at Mamallapuram is particularly striking, a stone temple complex built right on the beach, visible to ships approaching from the sea. It must have been an impressive sight for merchants and travellers arriving by ship. Your first view of India being this elaborate temple complex announcing that you'd reached a civilized, wealthy, sophisticated kingdom. It's medieval marketing, essentially, using architecture to project power and culture to outsiders. Welcome to our kingdom. Notice we have the resources and skill to build massive stone temples on beaches. Imagine what else we can do. Please conduct your trade here and leave your money. Subtle it was not, but effective it probably was. Now let's talk about the Cholas, because the Chola Empire from roughly 850 to 1250 CE was one of the most impressive medieval states anywhere in the world, and they don't get nearly enough attention in world history. The Cholas rose to power in the 9th century, expanded dramatically in the 10th and 11th centuries under a series of capable rulers, and at their peak controlled not just most of southern India, but also parts of Sri Lanka, the Maldives, and had extended their power to Southeast Asia through naval expeditions. Yes, naval expeditions. The Cholas weren't just a land power, they were one of the premier naval powers of the medieval world, projecting military and commercial power across the Indian Ocean. While medieval Europe was still figuring out how to build ships that could handle Atlantic voyages, the Cholas were launching military expeditions to Indonesia and establishing trading relationships across the entire Indian Ocean basin. Not bad for a kingdom based in what's now Tamil Nadu. The Chola Empire's rise to prominence really began with Rajaraja Choladhan, who ruled from 985 to 1014 CE. Rajaraja was one of those rulers who shows up every few generations and just dominates everything. Capable military commander, effective administrator, generous patron of religion and culture, and generally good at the whole ruling thing. He conquered territories across southern India, invaded Sri Lanka and brought much of it under Chola control, built up the navy, and sponsored the construction of the Brihadiswara temple at Thanjavur, one of the largest and most impressive Hindu temples ever built. The Brihadiswara temple is still standing, still impressive, and still functioning as a place of worship over 1,000 years later, which is pretty good durability for any structure, but especially for one topped with a massive stone cupola, weighing tons, that was somehow raised to the top of a tower over 200 feet tall using 11th century technology. The engineering alone is remarkable, but the temple also shows the Chola commitment to architectural grandeur as a statement of power and piety. We have the resources to build this enormous temple. We have the technical skill to make it structurally sound. We have the artistic talent to cover every surface with elaborate carvings. We have the devotion to dedicate it all to Shiva. Please be impressed. And people were impressed then and now. Rajaraja's son, Rajendra Chola I, who ruled from 1014 to 1044, continued and expanded his father's achievements. He completed the conquest of Sri Lanka, pushing deep into the island and bringing the whole thing under Chola control. He launched a remarkable military expedition north, marching his armies through the Deccan and all the way to the Ganges River in northern India, defeating various kingdoms along the way and bringing back water from the Ganges to symbolize his victory. This was mostly for prestige. He didn't actually annex all the territories he marched through. He just wanted to demonstrate that Chola power could reach anywhere in India. But the really impressive achievement was his naval expedition to Southeast Asia. Rajendra launched a major naval campaign against the Srivijaya Empire, a powerful maritime state controlling much of maritime Southeast Asia, including parts of modern Malaysia, Sumatra, and other islands. This wasn't just raiding. This was power projection across thousands of miles of ocean, requiring sophisticated ships, skilled navigators, and a logistical capacity to maintain a military force far from home. Medieval Europe couldn't do this. Medieval China could do it, but rarely bothered. The Cholas did it as part of their normal imperial policy, which tells you something about the sophistication of Indian naval technology and maritime culture that often gets overlooked when people focus on land-based empires. Why did the Cholas bother with these expensive overseas ventures? Trade. Always trade. The Indian Ocean was a vast commercial network connecting East Africa, the Middle East, India, Southeast Asia, and China. Enormous quantities of goods moved through this network. Spices, textiles, gems, metals, slaves, exotic animals, luxury goods of every description. Whoever controlled key ports and trade routes could tax this trade, enriching themselves while also ensuring their own merchants had preferential access to goods and markets. The Chola expeditions to Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia were partly about eliminating commercial rivals and establishing Chola dominance over lucrative trade routes. It was expensive to maintain a navy and launch overseas campaigns, but the commercial benefits apparently justified the costs. The Cholas understood that controlling maritime trade routes could be just as valuable as controlling agricultural land, which was a sophisticated economic insight for the medieval period when most kingdoms focused primarily on land-based resources. The Chola administrative system was quite sophisticated, with detailed records of land ownership, taxation, and resource management. Chola inscriptions, thousands of them carved on temple walls and stone tablets across their territories, give us remarkable insight into their administration. They describe land grants, tax assessments, irrigation works, temple management, and various other aspects of governance. The Cholas developed a system of local self-governance where village assemblies had significant autonomy in managing local affairs, with the central administration focusing on major policy, military matters, and collecting revenues. This decentralized system allowed for local flexibility while maintaining overall control, which is actually a pretty good model for governing a large territory with diverse regions and populations. Modern administrators might learn something from the Chola system, though admittedly modern administrators have better communication technology than messengers on foot or horseback, which does change the calculus somewhat. Chola society was hierarchical and organized around caste, as was typical throughout India. But within this hierarchical structure, there was considerable economic activity and social mobility, at least within caste boundaries. Trade and commerce flourished. Merchant guilds were powerful and sophisticated, conducting trade not just within India but across the Indian Ocean. Tamil merchants established communities in Southeast Asia, maintaining trading networks that lasted for centuries. These weren't just individual merchants travelling abroad. These were organised commercial communities with permanent settlements, their own temples, their own social structures, maintaining connections with their homeland while integrating to varying degrees with local societies. It's the medieval equivalent of modern diaspora communities, except with slower communications and higher mortality rates for travellers. The success of Tamil merchant communities across Southeast Asia is part of why Indian culture, Hindu religion, Sanskrit language, Indian architectural and artistic styles had such profound influence across the region. Culture merchants don't just transport goods, they transport ideas, practices, religious beliefs, and artistic styles. When you have temple construction was a major focus of Chola patronage, and the temples they built were extraordinary. We already mentioned the Brihadiswara temple, but it was hardly alone. Across Chola territory, elaborate temples were constructed, each serving as religious centres, community gathering places, and economic institutions. Temples owned vast amounts of land, controlled agricultural production, employed thousands of people, priests, musicians, dancers, craftspeople, administrators, and functioned as banks, lending money and storing valuables. A major temple was like a corporation, a university, a cathedral, and a bank all rolled into one, central to the economic and social life of its region. The temples also served as patrons of the arts. Dance, music, and drama were performed as offerings to the deities, and temple patronage supported artists and performers who maintained and developed classical traditions. Bharatanatyam, one of the major classical dance forms of India, was systematized and performed in Chola temples by Devadasis, women dedicated to temple service who were trained in dance and music. The Devadasi system is complicated and controversial. It provided education and artistic opportunities for women that were rare in medieval India, but it also involved problematic elements including exploitation and coercion in some cases. History is rarely simple, and institutions that had positive aspects in some ways could also have problematic aspects in others. Art during the Chola period reached high levels of achievement, particularly in bronze sculpture. Chola bronze sculptures of Hindu deities, particularly the famous Nataraja images showing Shiva as the cosmic dancer, are masterpieces of art and metallurgy. These weren't solid bronzes. They were hollow, cast using the lost wax process, requiring tremendous skill to create these complex forms with thin walls and fine details. The Nataraja image, with Shiva dancing within a ring of flames, 1 foot raised, multiple arms in symbolic positions, represents the cosmic dance of creation and destruction. It's both a religious icon and a work of art of extraordinary sophistication and beauty. Chola bronzes were so highly regarded that they were exported across Asia, and they remain prized by collectors and museums today. Original Chola bronzes can sell for millions of dollars at auction, though many were stolen from temples over the centuries, which is unfortunate because they should really be in the temples they were created for rather than in private collections or museums. But art theft is a whole separate depressing topic we probably shouldn't get into right now. Literature flourished during this period as well, particularly in Tamil. The Tamil literary tradition was already ancient by the Chola period, but it continued to develop with new works in poetry and prose. Religious poetry in praise of Shiva and Vishnu, composed by devotional poets called Nayanas and Alvars in earlier centuries, was compiled and celebrated. New philosophical and devotional works were composed. The Tamil language was standardized and codified. The Cholas supported both Tamil and Sanskrit literature, recognizing that Tamil was the language of their core region and population, while Sanskrit was the pan-Indian language of learning and high culture. This linguistic balance, supporting regional languages while also participating in the broader Sanskrit cosmopolis that connected educated elites across India, was typical of how successful medieval Indian kingdoms managed cultural affairs. You needed to appeal to local pride and identity by supporting the regional language and culture, but you also needed to participate in the broader Indian cultural world to maintain prestige and attract scholars and artists from beyond your borders. The maritime trade networks that the Cholas participated in and helped control were enormously important to the medieval world economy. The Indian Ocean trade connected 3 major economic zones: the Islamic world stretching from North Africa through the Middle East to Central Asia, the Indian subcontinent with its production of spices, textiles, and gems, and East and Southeast Asia with their silk, porcelain, spices, and various other goods. Trade goods moved through this network in all directions: African ivory and gold to India and beyond, Indian textiles and spices to the Middle East and Europe, Chinese silk and porcelain to India and the Islamic world. The volume of trade was substantial, probably larger than the Mediterranean trade that gets more attention in Western history. Indian Ocean merchants developed sophisticated commercial practices, credit instruments, insurance pools, commercial law, standard weights and measures, international partnerships across ethnic and religious lines. The fact that they managed to create a working trade network spanning thousands of miles tells you something about the sophistication of medieval commercial institutions that often gets overlooked when people assume the medieval period was primitive and backward. Ships in the Indian Ocean trade were sophisticated vessels, larger and more seaworthy than most people realize. Arab dhows are famous, but Indian ships were equally capable. They had multiple masts, sophisticated rigging, and navigational techniques using stars, landmarks, wind patterns, and careful observation of sea conditions. Sailors developed detailed knowledge of monsoon patterns, the seasonal winds that blow northeast during winter and southwest during summer, making it possible to sail predictably between India, Arabia, and East Africa. Understanding and using the monsoons was crucial to Indian Ocean trade. You sailed one direction during one season, traded and waited for the winds to shift, then sailed back during the opposite monsoon. This meant voyages were seasonal and required careful timing, but it also meant that skilled navigators could make the journeys reliably. European ships wouldn't enter the Indian Ocean in significant numbers until the late 15th century, and when they did, they found established trade networks, experienced merchants, and sophisticated commercial infrastructure that had been functioning for centuries. The European impact on Indian Ocean trade was eventually significant, but initially Europeans were newcomers trying to break into an existing system dominated by Indian, Arab, and Southeast Asian merchants who knew what they were doing and weren't particularly impressed by these newcomers with their small ships and aggressive attitudes. The political situation in northern India during the later medieval period became increasingly complex as new forces entered the picture. Turkish and Afghan Muslim rulers, having gradually expanded into northwestern India, began establishing sultanates that would eventually coalesce into the Delhi Sultanate, but that's really the next chapter in the story. For much of the medieval period we're discussing, northern India was fragmented among various Rajput kingdoms, warrior clans who controlled territories across Rajasthan, Gujarat, and parts of northern India. The Rajputs developed a distinctive culture emphasizing martial prowess, honor, chivalry, and independence. Rajput kingdoms were constantly fighting each other, forming and breaking alliances, and generally maintaining a state of perpetual low-level warfare that occasionally escalated into major conflicts. But they also built impressive fortresses, patronized poetry and music, and developed a romantic cultural tradition that would be celebrated in later literature. The Rajput period produced endless stories of brave warriors, beautiful princesses, elaborate sieges, noble sacrifices, and honorable defeats that make for great entertainment, but probably weren't as much fun to actually live through. Having your kingdom destroyed in a heroic last stand is very romantic in legend, but not so great in reality when you're the one getting conquered. The regional character of medieval Indian politics had advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantage is obvious: constant warfare, instability, inability to coordinate responses to external threats, and general chaos. But there were advantages too. Regional kingdoms often governed more effectively than distant imperial administrations could. They were more attuned to local conditions, local needs, local cultures. They could respond to local problems quickly without waiting for approval from a distant capital. Regional kingdoms often had deeper connections to local populations than imperial regimes imposed from outside, and cultural diversity flourished under regional rule. Different regions developed distinct artistic styles, architectural traditions, literary cultures, and religious practices that might have been homogenized under a strong central empire. Whether this trade-off was worth it probably depends on whether you value diversity over unity, and whether you're the kind of person who thinks efficiency and order are the highest political virtues, or whether you think messy diversity is more interesting and creative, even if it's less efficient. Reasonable people can disagree about this, which is why political philosophy is a subject rather than a solved problem. Trade wasn't just overseas during this period. Internal trade within India was also substantial and sophisticated. Goods moved along well-established trade routes connecting different regions. Northern wheat and textiles went south. Southern spices and metalwork went north. Regional specialization meant that different areas produced different goods. This region for cotton, that region for silk, this one for metalwork, that one for gems, and trade networks distributed these goods across the subcontinent. Market towns grew at major crossroads and river crossings. Merchant communities established themselves in commercial centers, often organized by religion or ethnicity into distinct quarters with their own temples, customs, and social structures. Cities like Ujjain, Kanchi, Varanasi, and others functioned as major commercial hubs where goods, ideas, and people from different regions mixed and exchanged. Urban culture flourished in these commercial centers, with distinct artistic and literary traditions emerging that reflected the cosmopolitan nature of trading cities, where people from diverse backgrounds interacted regularly. The stereotype of medieval society as static and isolated doesn't hold up when you look at the actual evidence of how much travel, trade, and cultural exchange was occurring. People moved around more than we often think, and goods moved around even more. Medieval India was connected to itself and to the wider world through commercial networks that functioned remarkably well despite the lack of modern transportation and communication technology. The religious landscape during medieval India was diverse and dynamic. Hinduism was evolving, with devotional movements emphasizing personal relationships with chosen deities rather than elaborate ritual. The Bhakti movement, which had started earlier, flourished during this period, producing poet-saints who composed devotional works in regional languages rather than Sanskrit. These Bhakti poets came from all castes and backgrounds. There were Brahmin Bhaktas, Shudra Bhaktas, even women Bhaktas, though they were rarer. What united them was intense devotion to their chosen deity, expressed through poetry and song that often bypassed formal ritual and priestly mediation. You didn't need a priest to love God, you just needed devotion. This was democratizing in its implications, suggesting that spiritual achievement was accessible regardless of caste or education or wealth. The Bhakti movement would continue to develop and spread, eventually becoming one of the most characteristic features of Hindu religiosity. Buddhism. The reasons are complex and debated. Buddhist institutions lost royal patronage as Hindu kingdoms became dominant. Philosophical developments within Hinduism addressed many of the same concerns that Buddhism had raised, reducing Buddhism's distinctiveness. Popular devotional Hinduism offered similar emotional satisfactions to Buddhist practice. Islamic invasions of northern India destroyed some major Buddhist centers, though this came later and can't explain the entire decline. Whatever the combination of factors, Buddhism, which had been founded in India and had flourished there for over a millennium, was fading in its homeland even as it thrived in other parts of Asia. By the end of the medieval period, Buddhism had nearly disappeared from India except in peripheral regions. Buddhism would be reintroduced to India in modern times by conversion movements and by refugees from Tibet. But for centuries, the birthplace of Buddhism had almost no Buddhists. History works in strange ways sometimes. Islam was beginning to enter India during the later medieval period, initially through trade and conversion rather than conquest. These Muslim merchant communities were generally tolerated and sometimes welcomed. They brought trade and revenue after all, and they maintained their religious identity while participating in the broader commercial culture. Some Indians converted to Islam, attracted by its egalitarian message, by the personal example of Muslim merchants and teachers, or by the practical advantages of joining a growing commercial network where Muslim merchants often gave preferential treatment to co-religionists. These conversions were generally peaceful, the result of persuasion rather than coercion. The more dramatic spread of Islam in India through military conquest would come later with the Turkish and Afghan invasions and the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate, but that's our next chapter. The medieval period we're discussing saw the beginning of Islam's presence in India, the initial contacts and conversions that established Muslim communities that would grow substantially in later centuries. The architecture of medieval India was spectacular and diverse, reflecting regional styles and dynastic preferences. Temples were the primary focus of architectural effort, and the temples built during this period by Chalukyas, Pallavas, Cholas, Rajputs, and others range from intimate shrines to massive temple complexes. The Khajuraho temples in central India, built by the Chandela dynasty in the 10th–11th centuries, are famous not just for their architectural sophistication, but for their explicit erotic sculptures depicting couples in various amorous positions. These sculptures have fascinated and scandalized visitors for centuries. Why would you put explicit sexual imagery on a temple? Theories abound. Maybe it represents the divine union of male and female principles. Maybe it's an esoteric tantric teaching. Maybe it's celebrating the life-affirming aspect of sexuality. Or maybe medieval sculptors just enjoyed carving erotic scenes, and the patrons were fine with it. We don't really know, and frankly the uncertainty makes it more interesting. What we do know is that the Khajuraho temples represent some of the finest examples of temple architecture and sculpture, and the erotic elements, whatever their meaning, are executed with the same skill and artistry as the religious imagery. Medieval Indian artists apparently didn't see sexuality and spirituality as incompatible, which is a refreshingly unshy attitude compared to some religious traditions that treat sexuality as shameful and better not discussed, let alone depicted on temple walls in explicit detail. The medieval period also saw the continued development of Sanskrit literature and drama, though regional languages were becoming increasingly important for literary production. Court poets composed elaborate works in Sanskrit praising their royal patrons, describing their military victories, and generally doing the medieval equivalent of PR work. These works are often formulaic and exaggerated. Every king is the greatest warrior ever, every victory is decisive and glorious, every royal quality is at superhuman levels. But they also contain genuine literary artistry and provide valuable historical information if you read them critically. You learn to discount the praise and look for the details that the poets might mention incidentally. What regions are being fought over? What alliances exist? What goods are valuable? What religious practices are being patronized? Reading Sanskrit court poetry is like reading corporate press releases. You have to understand that the surface message is propaganda, but you can extract useful information if you read between the lines and know what to look for. Regional literatures flourished as languages like Tamil, Kannada, Telugu, and others developed sophisticated literary traditions. The medieval period,